The English Civil War that convulsed the British Isles between 1642 and 1651, transforming a constitutional dispute between Crown and Parliament into the most devastating military conflict England had experienced since the Wars of the Roses, emerged from fundamental contradictions within the English political system that had been accumulating since the Norman Conquest established the framework of centralized royal authority balanced against baronial privileges and emerging representative institutions. The catastrophic breakdown that produced three separate wars, regicide, republican experiment, and ultimately the execution of a reigning monarch, represented not a sudden rupture, but rather the culmination of centuries-long tensions between competing visions of sovereignty, the proper relationship between temporal and spiritual authority, and the distribution of power within an increasingly complex society, experiencing profound economic, social, and religious transformation. The roots of the conflict extended deep into the medieval constitutional settlement that had emerged from the struggle between monarchical centralization and baronial resistance, creating institutional arrangements that required continuous negotiation and compromise rather than establishing clear supremacy for either royal prerogative or parliamentary authority. The Norman invasion of 1066 had established a feudal system that concentrated military and political power in the hands of a warrior aristocracy bound to the crown through personal oaths and land tenure, creating a hierarchy of obligation that theoretically ensured royal control over the kingdom's military resources, while practically requiring constant management of baronial ambitions and regional power structures. William the Conqueror's systematic redistribution of English lands to his Norman followers, documented comprehensively in the Domesday Book of 1086, created a new aristocratic class whose power derived from royal favour, but whose territorial dominance required acknowledgement of their interests in the exercise of royal authority. The Plantagenet kings who succeeded the Norman dynasty developed increasingly sophisticated administrative machinery for extracting revenue, administering justice, and projecting royal authority throughout the realm. But these very innovations created new points of friction as royal officials implemented policies that affected property rights, legal privileges, and customary practices that local communities viewed as fundamental to their liberties. The baronial revolt that produced Magna Carta in 1215 established crucial precedents limiting arbitrary royal power, particularly regarding taxation and arbitrary imprisonment, creating legal principles that would be invoked repeatedly during subsequent constitutional struggles, including the 17th century crisis. The development of Parliament as an institution during the 13th and 14th centuries reflected the practical necessity of securing consent for extraordinary taxation, while providing a forum for presenting grievances and participating in legislation, creating expectations of consultation and consent that would prove impossible to reconcile with later theories of absolute monarchy. The evolution of Parliament from occasional assemblies summoned at royal discretion into a regular component of English governance occurred gradually through precedents established during fiscal crises, military emergencies, and periods of weak or contested monarchy, when baronial and gentry cooperation became essential for effective rule. The division of Parliament into separate houses, representing the Lords temporal and spiritual in the upper chamber and county knights, and borough representatives in the Commons, created a bicameral structure that reflected England's complex social hierarchy, while providing multiple constituencies with formal mechanisms for participating in governance. The 100 Years' War with France, extending intermittently from 1337 to 1453, required sustained military efforts that could only be financed through parliamentary taxation, strengthening Parliament's leverage, while establishing expectations that major policy decisions, particularly regarding warfare and taxation, required parliamentary consent. The Wars of the Roses, devastating England between 1455 and 1487, through dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of disputed succession and weak monarchy, while creating conditions that would enable the Tudor dynasty to establish unprecedented royal authority through restoration of order and systematic elimination of potential rivals. The Tudor settlement that emerged from Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 created the foundation for a century of strong monarchical government that would paradoxically both strengthen royal authority and establish institutions and expectations that would later constrain royal power when wielded by less politically adept rulers. Henry VII's systematic approach to consolidating power combined ruthless elimination of potential dynastic rivals with careful cultivation of parliamentary cooperation, recognizing that effective monarchy required both unchallenged succession and functional working relationships with the landed gentry who dominated local administration and parliamentary representation. The Court of Star Chamber and other prerogative courts established by Henry VII provided mechanisms for royal justice that could bypass common law procedures and traditional legal protections when necessary to maintain order and suppress aristocratic violence, creating instruments that would later be viewed as engines of tyranny when employed without the political skill that had made them acceptable under Tudor rule. The fiscal policies developed under Henry VII, emphasizing careful management of crown lands, exploitation of feudal revenues, and avoidance of expensive foreign wars, provided the monarchy with financial independence that reduced reliance on parliamentary taxation, while accumulating reserves that his successors would rapidly exhaust through more ambitious policies. Henry VIII's break with Rome, initiated by his desire to secure annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, but expanded into comprehensive assertion of royal supremacy over the English Church, represented one of the most profound transformations in English governance and society, creating religious divisions and constitutional precedents that would fundamentally shape the 17th century crisis. The Act of Supremacy of 1534, declaring the monarch supreme head of the Church of England, transferred vast ecclesiastical authority from papal to royal control, while requiring all subjects to acknowledge this revolutionary change through oaths that would create enduring questions about the relationship between religious conscience and political obedience. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, justified as reform of corrupt institutions but motivated substantially by fiscal necessity, transferred enormous landed wealth to the crown, while providing opportunities for the gentry to acquire former monastic properties, creating a new class of landowners with vested interests in maintaining the Protestant settlement that had enabled their social and economic advancement. The religious changes implemented under Henry VIII remained theologically conservative despite the institutional break with Rome, maintaining traditional Catholic doctrine while eliminating papal authority, creating ambiguity about the ultimate direction of English religious development that would intensify during subsequent reigns. The brief reign of Edward VI, from 1547 to 1553, witnessed rapid movement toward Protestant theology and practice under the direction of his regents and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, producing the Book of Common Prayer and doctrinal formulations that would provide the foundation for later Anglican identity, while provoking resistance from conservative elements within English society. The Marian restoration of Catholicism between 1553 and 1558, accompanied by persecution of Protestant leaders and attempted reversal of the Henrician settlement, demonstrated the fragility of religious change imposed through royal authority, while creating Protestant martyrs, whose deaths would be commemorated in John Foxe's acts and monuments, profoundly influencing English Protestant identity and anti-Catholic sentiment. Elizabeth I's accession in 1558 brought another religious reversal, re-establishing Protestantism through the Elizabethan settlement that sought a middle way between Catholic tradition and Reformed innovation, creating a church order that satisfied neither committed Protestants nor Catholic recusants, but provided sufficient flexibility to maintain broad conformity during Elizabeth's long reign. The Elizabethan settlements via media attempted to combine Protestant theology with retention of episcopal church government and ceremonial elements that preserved continuity with pre-Reformation practice, creating a religious establishment that subsequent generations would interpret differently according to their own theological commitments and political interests. The Elizabethan church settlement, established through the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity in 1559, created a Protestant establishment that would prove increasingly difficult to maintain as religious divisions within English. Protestantism intensified, and external threats from Catholic powers shaped domestic religious politics throughout the later 16th century. The retention of episcopal church government under royal supremacy, combined with prescribed liturgy and ceremonial elements that conservative Protestants viewed as insufficiently reformed, created ongoing tensions between the official church and the Puritan movement that sought more thorough reformation. Along continental reformed lines, the Puritan critique of the Elizabethan Church focused on both theological issues, particularly regarding predestination and the nature of grace, and practical concerns about ceremonies, clerical vestments, and church governance, with the most radical elements rejecting episcopal authority entirely in favor of Presbyterian or congregational church organization. The prophesyings or preaching exercises that emerged during the 1570s, gatherings of clergy for sermon practice and theological discussion, represented Puritan attempts to improve preaching quality and promote godly reformation, but Elizabeth viewed these assemblies as potential sources of religious dissent and ordered their suppression, despite their popularity among committed Protestants. The Martin Marprelate tracts published secretly in 1588 and 1589, viciously satirizing the bishops and episcopal government, demonstrated the depth of Puritan alienation from the established church, while provoking severe repression that drove some Puritans toward separatism and others toward patient work within the system, awaiting better opportunities. Reform, the Catholic recusant community, composed of those who refused to attend Protestant services as required by law, faced escalating penalties, including fines, property confiscation, and exclusion from public office, creating a persecuted minority whose loyalty to the crown remained suspect despite most Catholics' political loyalty to Elizabeth as legitimate sovereign. The papal bull Regnans in Excelsis, issued in 1570, excommunicating Elizabeth and releasing her subjects from their allegiance, transformed English Catholics' position by appearing to justify rebellion while providing Protestant critics with evidence that Catholicism and loyalty to the English crown were fundamentally incompatible. The seminary priests, trained at English colleges established on the continent, particularly at Douai and Rome, who infiltrated England to minister to recusant communities, faced execution as traitors when captured, creating a stream of Catholic martyrs whose deaths paralleled earlier Protestant martyrdoms under Mary, and complicated narratives about religious persecution. The Jesuit mission to England, beginning in 1580, led by figures including Edmund Campion and Robert Parsons, intensified government fears of Catholic conspiracy, while dividing the Catholic community between those who sought accommodation with the Protestant regime and those who hoped for its overthrow through Spanish intervention or domestic rebellion. The Spanish Armada of 1588, Philip II's attempt to invade England and restore Catholicism, represented the culmination of escalating tensions between Protestant England and Catholic Spain, and its defeat, through combination of English naval action and devastating storms, became a defining moment in English Protestant identity, interpreted as divine providence protecting the Protestant nation. The war with Spain, that continued until 1604, required sustained military and financial efforts that strained Elizabethan governance, while creating expectations of parliamentary involvement in major policy decisions. As the Crown's ordinary revenues proved inadequate for financing extended military operations, requiring parliamentary taxation, the parliamentary sessions of Elizabeth's later reign witnessed increasing tensions over royal prerogatives, particularly regarding monopolies and economic regulation, with the Commons becoming more assertive in claiming rights to discuss matters that Elizabeth insisted remained within royal prerogative, establishing precedents for parliamentary activism that would intensify under the Stuarts. The succession question that dominated Elizabeth's reign created persistent anxiety about political stability and religious settlement, as Elizabeth's refusal to marry or designate an heir left the succession uncertain until the final years of her reign, when James VI of Scotland emerged as the likely successor, despite statutory disabilities affecting his claim. The accession of James VI of Scotland to the English throne, as James I in 1603 brought a foreign king, educated in Scottish Presbyterian church governance and continental political theory, to rule a kingdom with very different constitutional traditions, religious practices, and political expectations, creating immediate tensions that would accumulate throughout his reign, despite James's genuine desire to prove himself an effective English monarch. The peaceful succession itself represented a significant achievement, as the union of the Scottish and English crowns, through James's descent from Henry VII's daughter, Margaret Tudor, avoided the succession crisis that many had feared. But the personal union of two kingdoms, with distinct legal systems, religious establishments, and political cultures, created ongoing complications that James's vision of closer integration could not overcome. James's political philosophy, most fully articulated in his works, The True Law of Free Monarchies and Basilicon Doron, written before his accession to the English throne, emphasized divine right monarchy and royal authority derived directly from God rather than popular consent, placing him in tension with English common law traditions that conceived royal power as bounded by ancient custom and parliamentary statute. The Hampton Court Conference of 1604, convened to address Puritan grievances about church ceremonies and governance, demonstrated James's commitment to maintaining episcopal church government while making minor concessions on translation of scripture, producing the King James Bible that would become the defining English translation, but disappointing Puritan hopes for substantial reform of church practices. James's handling of Catholic recusants initially appeared more moderate than Elizabeth's approach, reducing financial penalties and allowing some degree of private Catholic worship. But the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, an attempt by Catholic conspirators to blow up Parliament with the king and leading Protestant nobles in attendance, destroyed any possibility of reconciliation and led to intensified persecution that would continue throughout his reign. The discovery of the Gunpowder Plot through betrayal by one conspirator and the subsequent torture and execution of the plotters, including the celebrated capture of Guy Fawkes, found guarding the explosives beneath Parliament, created a propaganda windfall for the Protestant regime, while establishing November 5th as an annual celebration of deliverance that reinforced anti-Catholic sentiment in English popular culture. The parliamentary sessions of James's early reign revealed tensions over fiscal policy as the Crown's financial needs exceeded ordinary revenues, while Parliament proved reluctant to grant adequate taxation, without addressing grievances about impositions, monopolies, and alleged abuses of prerogative power, establishing patterns of mutual frustration that would characterize Stuart parliamentary relations. The Great Contract, proposed in 1610, an ambitious attempt to resolve the Crown's fiscal problems through parliamentary agreement to provide regular annual revenue in exchange for abolition of feudal dues and prerogative revenues, failed through inability of Crown and Commons to agree on terms, representing a lost opportunity to place Crown finances on sustainable footing while establishing clear boundaries between royal and parliamentary fiscal authority. James's foreign policy, particularly his pursuit of Spanish alliance through a proposed marriage between his son Charles and a Spanish infanta, alienated many subjects who viewed Spain as the primary Catholic threat to Protestant Europe and expected England to support Protestant forces in the developing crisis that would become the 30 Years' War. The outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618, beginning with the Bohemian revolt against Habsburg authority, created expectations that James would support his son-in-law, Frederick V's acceptance of the Bohemian crown, and more broadly assist Protestant forces against Catholic imperial power. But James's preference for diplomatic solutions and his hope for Spanish alliance prevented the military intervention that many of his subjects demanded. The Parliament of 1621, recalled after a gap of several years, during which James had attempted to govern without parliamentary sessions, witnessed unprecedented assertions of parliamentary privilege, including claims to discuss foreign policy despite James's insistence that such matters fell within royal prerogative, leading to confrontation that ended with James dissolving Parliament and imprisoning leading members who had challenged royal authority. The Spanish match negotiations that dominated James's final years demonstrated his commitment to diplomatic solutions and his belief that marriage alliance could resolve the religious and political tensions dividing Europe. But the expedition of Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham to Madrid in 1623 to personally negotiate the match ended in humiliating failure that discredited the entire Spanish policy. The collapse of the Spanish match negotiations resulted partly from Spanish demands for religious concessions that English Protestant opinion would not tolerate, including suspension of penal laws against Catholics and permission for Catholic worship, and partly from Charles's personal affronts during the Madrid visit, when Spanish court protocol and religious restrictions proved incompatible with his expectations as Protestant prince and potential consort. The reversal in English foreign policy following the failed Spanish match, leading to alliance with France and preparation for war against Spain, required parliamentary cooperation for financing military operations, but the Parliament summoned in 1624 proved willing to grant supply, only with conditions regarding its expenditure that challenged traditional royal control over military affairs and foreign policy. James's death in March 1625 brought Charles I to the throne at a moment of international crisis and military preparation, inheriting policies that required sustained parliamentary cooperation, while possessing a personal commitment to royal prerogative and divine right that would prove less flexible than his father's more pragmatic, if theoretically, absolutist approach. Charles's immediate marriage to Henrietta Maria of France, arranged as part of the French alliance, brought a Catholic queen to England, with stipulations allowing her household to practice Catholicism openly, creating a permanent Catholic presence at court that would fuel suspicions about the king's own religious commitments throughout his reign. The Parliament that assembled in June 1625 granted Charles inadequate supply for the military operations against Spain that it had previously supported, reflecting distrust of Charles's chief minister, the Duke of Buckingham, and concern about the king's intentions, while also initiating impeachment proceedings against religious figures associated with Arminian theological positions that many viewed as crypto-Catholic. The granting of tonnage and poundage, customs duties that traditionally were granted to monarchs for life at their accession, for only 1 year represented an unprecedented limitation that Charles interpreted as profound disrespect, leading him to continue collecting these duties without parliamentary authorization and creating a source of constitutional grievance that would persist throughout the 1630s. Buckingham's disastrous military expeditions, including the failed attack on Cadiz in 1625 and the unsuccessful intervention at La Rochelle in support of French Huguenots in 1627, demonstrated English military incompetence while consuming resources that produced no strategic advantage, intensifying parliamentary criticism of the favourite who monopolised royal favour and appeared responsible for repeated policy failures. The forced loan of 1626, implemented when Parliament refused adequate taxation, required subjects to lend money to the Crown under threat of imprisonment for refusal, provoking resistance that led to imprisonment of prominent figures, including members of the gentry who denied the legality of non-parliamentary taxation, establishing precedents about arbitrary imprisonment that would feature prominently in subsequent constitutional debates. The Five Knights case of 1627, in which imprisoned forced loan resistors sought writs of habeas corpus, resulted in judicial decision that the king could imprison subjects without showing cause when matters of state were involved, appearing to legitimize arbitrary detention and provoking widespread alarm about threats to traditional English liberties rooted in common law protections. The Parliament of 1628, summoned when renewed military operations required supply that could only be obtained through parliamentary grant, witnessed an unprecedented assertion of parliamentary authority through the Petition of Right, a formal statement of subjects' liberties that challenged recent royal policies regarding arbitrary imprisonment, non-parliamentary taxation, martial law, and forced billeting of soldiers. The Petition of Right, presented to Charles in June 1628, represented Parliament's most comprehensive challenge to royal policies that appeared to threaten traditional liberties, citing Magna Carta and subsequent statutes to establish that imprisonment without cause shown, taxation without parliamentary consent, imposition of martial law, and compulsory billeting of soldiers violated fundamental principles of English law and custom. Charles's initial response to the petition attempted to acknowledge parliamentary concerns while preserving royal prerogative through ambiguous language that the Commons rejected as inadequate, forcing the king to accept the petition in traditional form that gave it statutory force, though Charles would subsequently interpret his acceptance as not constraining his essential prerogatives. The assassination of the Duke of Buckingham in August 1628 by a disgruntled military officer removed the focus of parliamentary hostility and the chief architect of failed foreign policies, but rather than improving relations between Charles and Parliament, Buckingham's death eliminated a potential scapegoat and forced Parliament to direct its criticisms more directly at royal policies and the King's own judgment. The parliamentary session of 1629 witnessed escalating confrontation over religious issues, as members influenced by Puritan convictions attacked Arminian clergy, who emphasized ceremony and episcopal authority while appearing to moderate Calvinist teachings about predestination and grace, viewing these theological developments as dangerous innovations that threatened the Protestant character of the English Church. Charles's commitment to supporting clergy attacked by Parliament, including his promotion of Arminians to positions of ecclesiastical authority, reflected both his personal theological preferences and his determination to maintain royal control over church appointments against parliamentary interference, creating an association between Arminianism and royal authority that would shape the religious politics of the personal rule. The dramatic scenes that concluded the 1629 parliamentary session, with the Speaker held in his chair by force, while the Commons passed resolutions condemning religious innovation and illegal taxation before the King could dissolve Parliament, represented an extraordinary breakdown of parliamentary procedure that Charles interpreted as justification for dispensing with parliamentary sessions indefinitely. The 11 years of personal rule that followed the dissolution of Parliament in 1629, during which Charles governed without summoning Parliament through exploitation of traditional revenue sources and careful avoidance of policies that would require parliamentary taxation, demonstrated both the theoretical possibility of governing without Parliament and the practical limitations that would ultimately force the King to recall Parliament when military crisis made non-parliamentary governance unsustainable. The fiscal expedients employed during the personal rule exploited ambiguities in English law and precedents from medieval practice, including revival of forest laws that imposed fines on those who had encroached on former royal forests, enforcement of ancient boundaries that subjected property to forest law, and extension of knighthood obligations that required those with lands above certain values to either accept knighthood or pay substantial fines for declining the honour. The most controversial fiscal measure of the personal rule was ship money, a levy traditionally imposed on coastal counties for naval defence, but extended by Charles to inland counties, on grounds that maritime security benefited the entire kingdom, transforming an occasional emergency measure into an annual tax imposed without parliamentary consent that generated substantial revenue while provoking constitutional challenges. John Hampden's refusal to pay ship money in 1637 resulted in a test case that attracted enormous attention, as the legal arguments addressed fundamental questions about the extent of royal prerogative in matters of defence and taxation, with the judges ruling narrowly in favour of the Crown, but with substantial dissents that encouraged continued resistance to the levy. The religious policies implemented during the personal rule under Archbishop William Laud, appointed to Canterbury in 1633, emphasised ceremonial uniformity, episcopal authority, and what critics viewed as innovations that moved the Church of England in a Catholic direction, including emphasis on altar placement, bowing at the name of Jesus, and suppression of Puritan preaching and theological positions that emphasize predestination. The Laudian reforms implemented throughout the English Church during the 1630s represented a systematic attempt to impose ceremonial and theological uniformity that Archbishop Laud justified as restoration of proper reverence and order, but that opponents experienced as persecution of godly Protestantism and advancement of crypto-Catholic practices incompatible with Reformed theology. Laud's metropolitical visitations throughout English dioceses enforced conformity to prescribed ceremonies, vestments, and church furnishings through ecclesiastical courts that could impose fines, suspend clergy from their positions, and in extreme cases, pursue prosecution in prerogative courts, including Star Chamber and High Commission, where traditional common law protections did not apply. The emphasis on altar rails separating the communion table from the congregation, positioning of altars at the east end of churches, and requirement that communicants kneel to receive the sacrament appeared to many Protestants to elevate the Eucharist in ways that suggested Catholic belief in transubstantiation, undermining Protestant teaching about the symbolic nature of communion. The prosecution of Puritan critics through Star Chamber, including the notorious cases of William Prynne, Henry Burton, and John Bastwick, who were sentenced to have their ears cropped and to be imprisoned indefinitely for publishing attacks on episcopal government and Laudian ceremonies, demonstrated the regime's willingness to employ brutal punishment against religious dissent, while creating martyrs whose suffering would be commemorated after the regime's collapse. The emigration of thousands of Puritans to New England during the 1630s, establishing colonies at Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut that would become strongholds of Reformed Protestantism and Republican political ideology, reflected despair about the possibility of further reformation in England and determination to establish godly communities free from episcopal interference and Laudian innovations. The Book of Sports, reissued by Charles in 1633, requiring clergy to read from their pulpits royal permission for recreation on Sundays after divine service, offended Puritan sensibilities about Sabbath observance while appearing to trivialize religious worship in favor of popular entertainments, creating another source of conflict between godly ministers and episcopal authority. Charles's support for Laud and Arminian clergy reflected his conviction that episcopal authority and ceremonial order were essential for maintaining proper religious discipline and social hierarchy, viewing Puritan criticism of bishops and ceremonies as threatening both church and state through encouragement of popular religious enthusiasm that could undermine established authority. The extension of Laudian policies to Scotland, where the Presbyterian Kirk had developed very different traditions, emphasizing ministerial authority, lay participation in church governance through elderships, and simplified worship without prescribed liturgy or ceremonies, demonstrated Charles's determination to impose religious uniformity across his kingdoms without adequate understanding of Scottish religious culture or political structures. The attempt to impose the Book of Common Prayer on Scotland in 1637, implemented through Charles's prerogative authority, without consultation with either the General Assembly of the Kirk or Scottish Parliament, provoked immediate and widespread resistance that rapidly escalated from spontaneous riots during the first attempted use of the prayer book at St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh to organised national opposition. The National Covenant signed in February 1638 bound Scottish subscribers to maintain Presbyterian church government and Reformed worship against the innovations that Charles was attempting to impose, combining religious commitment with political resistance in a document that would become the founding statement of the Covenanter movement that would dominate Scottish politics for the next decade. The subscribers to the National Covenant included nobles, lairds, burgesses, and common people across Scottish society, representing a far broader coalition than Charles's government had anticipated, and demonstrating the extent to which the king's religious policies had united disparate elements of Scottish society in opposition to royal authority. The bishops' wars that resulted from Charles's attempt to suppress Scottish resistance to his religious policies exposed the fundamental weakness of the personal rule regime, as the king lacked both the financial resources and military organisation necessary to conduct sustained military operations without parliamentary cooperation, that he remained unwilling to seek until military disaster made it unavoidable. The first mobilization in 1639 produced an English army inadequately trained, poorly supplied, and uncertain in its commitment to enforcing religious conformity on Scotland, while the Covenanter forces benefited from experienced Scottish officers returning from continental service and from widespread popular support that provided both troops and resources for sustained resistance. The Treaty of Berwick in June 1639, ending the First Bishops' War without military engagement, represented a temporary compromise that satisfied neither side, as Charles interpreted it as opportunity to prepare more effectively for renewed military action, while the Covenanters understood it as recognition of their right to maintain Presbyterian church government and to ratify their religious settlement through General Assembly and Scottish Parliament. The Scottish General Assembly and Parliament that met following the Treaty of Berwick systematically dismantled the episcopal church structure that Charles had attempted to maintain, abolishing bishops and establishing Presbyterian church government through a hierarchy of church courts, from Kirk Sessions to General Assembly, while also asserting parliamentary authority over issues that Charles considered royal prerogatives, including military command and foreign policy. Charles's determination to reduce Scottish resistance through military force, despite the failure of the first campaign, reflected his conviction that royal authority could not be maintained if subjects could successfully resist through armed opposition. But his ability to finance and organize effective military operations remained constrained by the same limitations that had made the first campaign ineffective. The short parliament summoned in April 1640, after 11 years without parliamentary sessions, was called specifically to grant taxation for the Second Bishops' War, but the accumulated grievances from the personal rule dominated debate as members insisted on addressing constitutional and religious complaints before granting supply, leading Charles to dissolve Parliament after 3 weeks, when it became clear that the Commons would not provide funds without substantial concessions. The Second Bishops' War commenced in summer 1640, with English military preparations no more adequate than in 1639. Despite Charles's determination to prosecute the campaign more vigorously, while the Covenanter army demonstrated superior organization, discipline, and strategic planning that reflected both their religious commitment and the military experience of their leadership. The Scottish invasion of northern England in August 1640, crossing the border and occupying Newcastle to secure the coalfields that supplied London with fuel, demonstrated the Covenanters' strategic sophistication while exposing the English army's inability to resist, as English forces fled from the Battle of Newburn without serious engagement, leaving the north under Scottish occupation. The Treaty of Ripon in October 1640, concluding the Second Bishops' War, required Charles to pay the Scottish army £850 per day for its maintenance while occupying English territory, creating an impossible financial burden that could only be met through parliamentary taxation, thereby forcing the king to summon Parliament and to maintain it in session, while the Scottish army remained in England as guarantee of parliamentary leverage. The Long Parliament that assembled in November 1640 possessed both the accumulated grievances from 11 years of non-parliamentary government and unprecedented leverage provided by the king's desperate fiscal situation, and the Scottish military presence that prevented him from dissolving Parliament without meeting the financial obligations required by the Treaty of Ripon. The parliamentary leadership that emerged during the early months of the Long Parliament included experienced members who had participated in the conflicts of the 1620s, bringing both deep knowledge of constitutional precedents and personal resentment of their treatment during the personal rule, particularly those who had been imprisoned for resistance to forced loans or ship money. The initial legislation of the Long Parliament proceeded with remarkable speed and apparent unity during late 1640 and early 1641, systematically dismantling the institutional foundations of personal rule while addressing grievances that had accumulated over the previous decade, and establishing parliamentary controls designed to prevent future attempts at non-parliamentary government. The Triennial Act, passed in February 1641, required Parliament to meet at least once every 3 years, and provided mechanisms for parliamentary assembly, even without royal summons if the king failed to call Parliament as required, establishing parliamentary sessions as regular and necessary components of English governance rather than extraordinary events dependent on royal discretion. The Act declaring the dissolution of the present Parliament illegal without its own consent ensured that Charles could not employ his prerogative to dissolve Parliament, as he had done in 1629, guaranteeing the Long Parliament's continued existence and its ability to complete its reform programme without facing premature dissolution. The abolition of Star Chamber and High Commission eliminated prerogative courts that had been used to enforce personal rule policies and prosecute religious and political dissent without the jury trials and common law protections that applied in regular courts, removing instruments that had symbolized arbitrary royal power. The Act declaring ship money illegal retroactively invalidated the judge's decision in Hampden's case and established that this form of non-parliamentary taxation violated subjects' rights, addressing one of the most controversial fiscal measures of the personal rule, while establishing parliamentary control over taxation more clearly than previous legislation. The Acts abolishing forest fines, knighthood fines, and other fiscal expedients of the 1630s eliminated revenue sources that Charles had exploited during personal rule, reducing crown income, while addressing grievances about policies that had affected property rights and revived obsolete medieval obligations. The impeachment and attainder of Charles's chief ministers, particularly Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, and Archbishop Laud, represented Parliament's determination to punish those responsible for personal rule policies, while removing advisers whose influence over the king Parliament viewed as pernicious and whose continued proximity to Charles threatened the security of the parliamentary leadership. Strafford's trial and execution in May 1641 marked a crucial escalation in the conflict between Charles and Parliament, as the attainder passed, when impeachment proceedings proved unable to establish guilt of treason, demonstrated Parliament's willingness to employ legislative means to eliminate political opponents, while the enormous public pressure for Strafford's death and Charles's abandonment of his minister, despite promises of protection, revealed the breakdown of normal political relationships. The crowd mobilization around Strafford's trial, with thousands of Londoners gathering daily to demonstrate support for his prosecution and presenting petitions demanding his death, demonstrated the popular dimension of the constitutional conflict while revealing the power of coordinated public pressure to influence parliamentary proceedings and intimidate potential opponents of the parliamentary leadership. Laud's imprisonment in the Tower following impeachment proceedings that would eventually lead to his execution in 1645 removed from active politics the architect of the religious policies that had alienated Puritans and moderate Protestants, though his removal did not resolve fundamental disagreements about church governance and worship that would intensify during subsequent years. The London Root and Branch petition presented to Parliament in December 1640, with thousands of signatures, demanded complete abolition of episcopal church government, representing the most radical Protestant position on church reform, while revealing the extent of anti-episcopal sentiment that Laudian policies had generated among the capital's population. The debate over the Root and Branch petition divided Parliament along lines that would become increasingly significant, with committed Protestants supporting abolition of episcopacy and more conservative members defending bishops while opposing only abuses of episcopal authority, creating fault lines that would shape subsequent religious and political conflicts. The Grand Remonstrance, debated and passed in November 1641, represented Parliament's most comprehensive statement of grievances against Charles's government, while also outlining a programme for further reform that included parliamentary control over ministerial appointments and systematic reformation of the Church, revealing the extent to which parliamentary unity was fragmenting as the reform agenda became more radical and the immediate threat that had united opposition to personal rule appeared to recede. The remonstrance passed by only 11 votes after an all-night debate characterized by unprecedented bitterness and accusations that revealed how religious and constitutional questions were dividing members who had previously cooperated in dismantling personal rule institutions, with opponents arguing that continued attacks on royal authority and church government would produce anarchy, while supporters insisted that the danger of Catholic conspiracy and arbitrary government required vigilant parliamentary oversight. The decision to print and publish the remonstrance, appealing to public opinion beyond Parliament, marked a significant escalation in political tactics, as it violated the traditional understanding that parliamentary proceedings should remain confidential, transforming constitutional debate into public political contest that encouraged popular mobilization and made compromise more difficult. The Irish rebellion that erupted in October 1641 transformed the political situation in England by creating military emergency that required immediate response, while raising questions about control over military forces that would prove central to the final breakdown between Charles and Parliament. The Ulster Rising began with Catholic gentry attempting to seize strategic positions and recover lands confiscated during plantation schemes, but rapidly expanded as initial success encouraged broader participation, and as social and economic grievances, combined with religious and ethnic antagonism, to produce widespread violence against Protestant settlers. The reports of massacres reaching England, dramatically exaggerated in many cases, but rooted in genuine atrocities, created panic among English Protestants, who interpreted events as Catholic conspiracy, threatening Protestant populations throughout the British Isles, while also providing apparent confirmation of warnings about Catholic plotting that parliamentary leadership had been emphasizing. The military response to Ireland became the immediate issue, precipitating final breakdown between Charles and Parliament, as Parliament insisted on maintaining control over military appointments and strategic direction, while Charles asserted his traditional prerogative over military command, with both sides recognizing that control over forces raised for Ireland would determine the outcome of their domestic conflict. The additional instruction attached to the Militia Ordinance claimed parliamentary authority to appoint military commanders without royal consent, when the king's appointments might threaten the security of the kingdom, representing a revolutionary assertion that sovereignty ultimately resided in Parliament rather than the Crown, and that Parliament could act unilaterally when royal decisions threatened the public safety. Charles's attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament in January 1642, entering the House of Commons with armed supporters to apprehend John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, Arthur Hazelrig, and William Strode for treason, represented the king's most dramatic attempt to intimidate parliamentary opposition, while providing his opponents with spectacular evidence of tyrannical intentions that could be exploited in subsequent propaganda. The failure of the arrest attempt when the 5 members received warning and left Westminster before the king's arrival humiliated Charles, while demonstrating that elements within the royal household were providing intelligence to parliamentary leaders, undermining the king's ability to employ surprise while encouraging parliamentary fears that Charles was planning violent action against his opponents. Charles's departure from London following the failed arrest attempt, establishing his court initially at Hampton Court and then moving to York in March, marked the effective beginning of military mobilization, as both sides began securing arsenals, raising troops, and positioning forces while engaging in propaganda campaigns designed to win support from populations largely uncertain about the constitutional and religious issues that divided king and parliament. The competing claims to legitimacy advanced by Charles and Parliament during the spring and summer of 1642 reflected fundamental disagreement about the nature of sovereignty and the constitutional relationship between Crown, Parliament, with each side asserting that it acted to preserve traditional English government against revolutionary innovations proposed by the other. Charles's declarations emphasized his position as divinely appointed monarch, whose authority derived from God and immemorial custom, arguing that Parliament's claims to control military appointments, choose royal advisers, and reform the church without royal consent represented unprecedented usurpations that would reduce monarchy to empty ceremonial function, while transferring real power to an oligarchic parliament, claiming to speak for the people, but actually representing factional interests. The parliamentary position, articulated through declarations, ordinances, and pamphlets, asserted that Parliament represented the kingdom's political community and possessed inherent authority to act for the preservation of the realm when royal policies threatened subjects' lives, liberties, and religion, developing theories of mixed monarchy and coordination of powers that challenged traditional understandings of royal supremacy, while claiming continuity with ancient English constitutional practice. The Militia Ordinance issued by Parliament in March 1642, asserting parliamentary authority to appoint Lord Lieutenants and organise county militias without royal consent, represented the most direct challenge to royal prerogative, as military command had traditionally been recognised as quintessentially royal function. But Parliament argued that emergency conditions created by Irish rebellion and threats of Catholic conspiracy justified extraordinary measures to secure the kingdom's defence. Charles's Commission of Array, issued in June 1642, employing medieval precedent to raise forces through royal authority, exercised by commissioners appointed in each county, provided Royalist alternative to Parliament's Militia Ordinance, while demonstrating the king's determination to contest military control, creating a situation where competing authorities claimed to legitimately organise armed forces in the same localities. The propaganda war conducted through printed declarations, pamphlets, newsbooks, and sermons reached unprecedented intensity, as both sides sought to win support from gentry, merchants, urban populations, and common people whose political allegiance would determine the outcome of the developing conflict, producing an explosion of political literature that engaged broader segments of English society in constitutional and religious debate than ever before. The parliamentary propaganda emphasized themes of Protestant solidarity against Catholic conspiracy, defense of traditional English liberties against arbitrary power, and protection of property rights and parliamentary privileges that affected the interests of substantial members of society, while also deploying religious language that portrayed the conflict as struggle between godly reformation and popish innovation. Royalist propaganda stressed the dangers of disorder and social upheaval that would follow from parliamentary resistance to legitimate royal authority, emphasized the sanctity of oaths of allegiance and the sin of rebellion against God's appointed sovereign, and warned that parliamentary claims to represent the people masked ambitions of factional leaders seeking power for themselves. The mobilization of resources and recruitment of forces during summer 1642 revealed complex patterns of allegiance that defied simple geographical or social categorization, as individual counties, towns, and even families divided over whether to support king or parliament, based on combinations of religious commitment, constitutional principle, personal relationships, local rivalries, and calculations about security and advantage. The control of London provided Parliament with enormous advantages, including access to the country's largest population centre, its primary port and commercial hub, the wealth of merchant community willing to provide loans, and the symbolic importance of the capital, while also exposing parliamentary leadership to pressure from crowds and radical elements within the city's population that would complicate political decision-making throughout the conflict. Charles's establishment of his headquarters at York and his progress through the Midlands, securing support and gathering forces, demonstrated his determination to contest Parliament's challenge militarily, while also revealing the limited resources available to him in the northern and western regions, where Royalist sentiment proved strongest. The raising of the royal standard at Nottingham on August 22, 1642, constituted Charles's formal declaration that a state of war existed between himself and those he characterized as rebels, initiating military conflict that would ultimately claim the lives of perhaps 200,000 English, Scottish, and Irish people through combat, disease, and the systematic disruptions that sustained warfare inflicted upon communities throughout the three kingdoms. The ceremony at Nottingham proved inauspicious, as high winds blew down the standard shortly after its erection, an omen that contemporaries noted with superstitious dread and that reflected the king's desperately weak position, with forces numbering only a few thousand inadequately equipped and poorly trained men facing parliamentary armies that could draw on London's immense resources and the trained bands of the wealthy southern and eastern counties that had declared for Parliament. The initial military forces assembled by both sides consisted primarily of volunteer infantry regiments raised by individual nobles and gentry who received commissions from either king or Parliament, with each colonel responsible for recruiting, equipping, and maintaining his regiment through a combination of his own resources, contributions from supporters, and whatever pay the central authority could provide, creating armies that reflected England's social hierarchy, while depending entirely on the willingness of local communities to support military mobilization through providing men, supplies, and quarters. The cavalry formations drew primarily from men of sufficient property to provide their own horses and equipment, typically the sons of gentry families and substantial yeomen who possessed both the resources necessary for mounted service and the social status that made cavalry service appropriate to their standing, creating mounted forces whose effectiveness depended heavily on their willingness to maintain discipline under fire, rather than pursuing individual glory through uncontrolled charges that might break enemy formations but remove cavalry from the battlefield at crucial moments. The military experience available to both sides varied enormously across the social and military spectrum, with some commanders and soldiers having served in continental wars, including the Dutch revolt against Spain or the German campaigns of the 30 Years' War, others having participated in the bishops' wars against Scotland or the suppression of the Irish Rebellion, while many officers and most common soldiers possessed no experience beyond the limited training provided by county-trained bands that met only occasionally for exercises that emphasized parade ground drill, rather than the practical and skills of campaign warfare, including foraging, camp construction, and coordination of infantry with cavalry and artillery in actual combat conditions. The strategic situation in autumn 1642 found Royalist strength concentrated in the north, where the Earl of Newcastle commanded substantial forces raised from the traditional aristocratic estates of northern England. In the west, where Welsh loyalty to the crown and the influence of Royalist gentry provided reliable recruiting grounds, and in parts of the Midlands, where the king's presence and the efforts of local Royalist leaders had secured control of strategic towns and countryside. While Parliament controlled London, with its unmatched financial resources and trained bands numbering thousands of armed citizens, the south and east, where Puritan religious commitment and commercial interests aligned populations with the parliamentary cause, and the navy whose crews and officers had declared for Parliament, thereby securing control of England's coasts and enabling maritime trade that provided customs revenues essential for financing military operations. The Earl of Essex commanded Parliament's main field army with commission as Captain General and Lord General, bringing military experience from continental service under Maurice of Nassau in the Dutch wars and social prestige as a senior nobleman whose grandfather had been Elizabeth I's favourite, though his cautious temperament, shaped by constitutional conservatism and personal experience of political complexity, would create ongoing tensions with more aggressive parliamentary leaders who desired decisive action to crush Royalist forces through vigorous offensive operations, rather than the methodical campaigning that Essex's military judgment suggested was prudent, given his army's limited training and uncertain reliability. Charles's military leadership relied heavily on his nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, a 23-year-old cavalry commander who brought continental military experience gained during the 30 Years' War, and inherited martial talents from his parents, Frederick V, Elector Palatine, and Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of James I, displaying the combination of tactical brilliance, personal courage, and aristocratic self-confidence that made him both an inspirational leader for Royalist cavalry and a problematic figure whose impetuousness, disdain for civilian authority, and tendency to pursue tactical advantage without considering strategic consequences would create difficulties for the king's cause throughout the war. The first significant military engagement at Edgehill on October 23 1642, demonstrated both sides' military inadequacies in ways that would characterize much of the First Civil War, as Rupert's cavalry on the Royalist right wing achieved spectacular initial success by charging and breaking the Parliamentary cavalry, opposing them, pursuing the routed enemy for miles while plundering the Parliamentary baggage train, but thereby removing themselves from the main battle at the moment when their presence might have achieved decisive victory, while on the opposite flank Royalist cavalry similarly broke their opponents and pursued them from the field, leaving the infantry of both armies to fight inconclusive battles in the centre, where pike blocks pushed against each other in the traditional manner, while musketeers fired volleys at close range, creating enormous casualties without achieving breakthrough, the tactical draw at Edgehill, with both armies withdrawing from the field and claiming victory, while each suffered roughly equal casualties of several thousand men, killed and wounded, along with hundreds more who would die from wounds or disease in subsequent days, established patterns that would persist throughout the war, including the dominance of cavalry over poorly trained infantry in open field engagements, the crucial importance of maintaining discipline and coordination between different arms, rather than allowing individual units to pursue tactical opportunities that removed them from supporting the main army, and the difficulty of achieving decisive battlefield victory that would end the conflict through single engagement, given the similar military capabilities and tactical doctrines of forces that drew on the same English military traditions and employed largely identical weapons and formations. Charles's advance on London following Edgehill brought Royalist forces through the Thames Valley and to the western approaches of the capital at Turnham Green in mid-November, where Essex's reorganised army, reinforced by London-trained bands numbering perhaps 24,000 men, confronted Royalist forces of approximately 13,000 inches, a tense standoff that lasted an entire day without developing into battle, as the Parliamentary numerical superiority, combined with the obvious determination of London's citizens to defend their city, convinced Charles to withdraw rather than risk battle against superior numbers in position threatening his line of communications back to Oxford, thereby preserving parliamentary control of the capital that would prove strategically decisive by denying the king access to England's wealthiest city and its financial resources, while also preventing the capture of parliamentary leadership and the symbolic victory that taking London would have represented. The establishment of the king's wartime capital at Oxford transformed that university city into a fortified royalist stronghold, where Charles established his court, councils, and administrative apparatus, while the university's colleges provided accommodation for royal household, military officers, and the governmental machinery necessary for conducting war and maintaining authority over royalist-controlled territories. Though the concentration of military forces and courtiers in Oxford created tensions with the university and town populations, who resented requisitions, overcrowding, and the disruption of normal academic and commercial activities. The strategic stalemate that developed during winter 1642–43 reflected the geographical distribution of forces and resources across the kingdom, with neither side possessing sufficient military superiority to achieve decisive victory through single campaign, while both struggled to maintain armies in the field during winter months when campaigning traditionally ceased, to organize effective command structures that could coordinate operations across multiple theatres, and to secure the financial resources necessary for sustained military operations that consumed money at rates far exceeding pre-war governmental expenditure. Parliament's control of London and the wealthy southeastern counties provided access to customs revenues from England's primary port, and the ability to borrow substantial sums from London's merchant community willing to provide loans secured against future parliamentary taxation, and the prospect of commercial advantages that parliamentary victory might bring, creating financial advantages that would prove increasingly significant as the war continued, and costs accumulated, though the efficiency with which these resources could be mobilized and converted into military effectiveness depended heavily on the administrative capabilities of parliamentary committees and the willingness of London citizens to continue supporting war efforts despite the economic disruptions that military expenditure and the interruption of normal trade created. The Royalist financial position depended heavily on contributions from regions under royal control, including the agricultural wealth of the West and Wales, where traditional social hierarchies and personal loyalties provided mechanisms for extracting resources from populations through combinations of voluntary contribution from committed supporters and forced requisitions from those less enthusiastic. Revenue from Royalist-controlled ports, including Bristol, after its capture in 1643, and the ability to requisition supplies directly from local populations through free quarter that required civilians to provide food and lodging for soldiers without immediate payment, though theoretically, with promises of future compensation that rarely materialized. But these resources proved inadequate for maintaining forces comparable to parliamentary armies, while the lack of centralized financial administration hindered efficient collection and distribution of available resources across multiple regional commands that often competed for limited supplies and money. The regional campaigns conducted during 1643 involved multiple simultaneous theatres of operation that made coordination difficult and prevented either side from concentrating overwhelming force against the other's main armies, including fighting in the north where Royalist forces under the Earl of Newcastle confronted parliamentary armies under Ferdinando Lord Fairfax and his son Sir Thomas Fairfax, attempting to maintain parliamentary presence in Yorkshire and prevent complete Royalist control of the region. In the west, where Royalist dominance faced challenges from parliamentary strongholds, including Gloucester, which controlled the Severn Valley, and Plymouth, which denied Royalists complete control of Devon and Cornwall, in the Thames Valley and southern Midlands, where both sides manoeuvred for strategic advantage while conducting siege operations against fortified towns held by their opponents, and in East Anglia, where the Eastern Association, under the Earl of Manchester, organised the war effort in counties that provided Parliament with substantial resources, and developed the military forces that would later form the core of the TAIF, New Model Army. The Royalist victories in the north during spring and summer, 1643, demonstrated effective military leadership, and the advantages that unity of command provided, as Newcastle's forces defeated the Fairfaxes at Adwalton Moor in June, which secured Yorkshire for the king, and eliminated effective parliamentary resistance in the north, except for isolated garrisons in towns including Hull, whose control of the Humber estuary and access to supplies by sea enabled it to withstand Royalist siege, threatening to enable concentration of northern Royalist forces for advance on London or junction with the King's main army in the Midlands, that might achieve the overwhelming superiority necessary for decisive victory. The Western campaigns during 1643 witnessed significant Royalist successes that transformed the strategic situation by providing the king with access to important ports and eliminating parliamentary strongholds that had prevented a Royalist consolidation of territorial control, most notably the capture of Bristol in July after siege operations, followed by assault that overwhelmed the city's defenders despite their determination to resist, providing the king with England's second city, a major port with facilities for importing supplies and maintaining naval forces, and access to maritime trade that could supplement the inadequate revenues available from Royalist-controlled agricultural regions, while also demonstrating that even strongly fortified cities could fall to determined assault if defenders lacked adequate numbers, or if attacking forces were willing to accept the casualties that storming operations inevitably produced. The parliamentary garrison's stubborn defence of Gloucester from August to September 1643, withstanding Royalist siege that sought to capture this crucial city, controlling the Severn crossing and threatening Royalist control of South Wales and the Welsh marches, demonstrated that determined defence could prevent Royalist consolidation of territorial gains if garrisons received adequate supplies, maintained morale through religious conviction and commitment to the cause, and could hope for relief by field armies that might raise sieges before starvation or assault force surrender, while the city's successful resistance until Essex's army marching from London relieved the siege in early September, represented significant parliamentary propaganda victory that demonstrated continued parliamentary military Effectiveness. Despite the setbacks suffered elsewhere during the campaigning season, the First Battle of Newbury, fought on September 20, 1643, as Essex's army returning from relieving Gloucester encountered Royalist forces that Charles and Rupert had positioned to block the road to London, hoping to destroy Parliament's main field army and thereby achieve decisive strategic advantage that might force parliamentary surrender, resulted in another tactically inconclusive engagement with heavy casualties on both sides, as parliamentary forces fought desperately to break through Royalist positions that commanded the road to London, while Royalist attacks sought to envelop and destroy Essex's army, though the Royalists' eventual withdrawal from the battlefield, allowing Essex to continue his march to London, prevented the strategic catastrophe that destruction of Parliament's main field army would have represented, while demonstrating that neither side yet possessed the tactical superiority or numerical advantage necessary to achieve decisive battlefield victory. The military situation by autumn 1643 appeared favourable to Royalists, despite the inconclusive nature of major battles and the failure to achieve decisive victory through single engagement, as territorial gains in the north and west, combined with Parliament's financial difficulties created by the enormous costs of maintaining multiple armies and conducting extensive military operations, the apparent exhaustion of London's population under sustained military burdens, including taxation, quartering of troops, and disruption of normal commerce, and the growing divisions within the parliamentary coalition between those who desired vigorous prosecution of the war until complete victory, and those who hoped for negotiated settlement that would restore the king with appropriate constitutional limitations, suggested that continued pressure might force Parliament to negotiate settlement on terms favourable to the king, or might produce military collapse, as financial exhaustion prevented Parliament from maintaining adequate forces. The political situation within areas controlled by both sides revealed mounting tensions between military necessity that required extraction of resources from local populations and civilian governance that sought to maintain normal administrative structures and protect the interests of county gentry who dominated those structures, as armies required supplies, including food for men and horses, quarters in barns and houses, wagons for transporting artillery and supplies, and recruits to replace casualties and desertion that constantly depleted the ranks, while local populations resented providing these resources through combinations of taxation that exceeded anything experienced in peacetime, free quarter that required civilians to support soldiers without payment, and impressment that forced men into military service against their will and disrupted agricultural labour necessary for producing the food that sustained both civilian populations and military forces. Parliament's relationship with London witnessed growing tensions as the enormous costs of war and the increasing influence of radical religious and political voices among the city's population, particularly in the independent congregations that rejected Presbyterian church discipline and advocated broader religious toleration, alongside more aggressive prosecution of the war effort, created pressures that moderate parliamentary leaders, including Essex and other nobles, found troubling because they threatened to transform the constitutional conflict into social revolution that would challenge property rights, traditional hierarchies, including demands for more vigorous prosecution of the war through replacement of cautious commanders who appeared unwilling to risk their forces in decisive battles, suspicions about the commitment of nobles like Essex, whose social position and constitutional conservatism might make them prefer negotiated settlement over complete military victory, and calls for religious reforms that would not only abolish episcopacy, but establish Presbyterian church government with power to enforce religious discipline over the entire population, or alternatively, allow congregational independence that would fragment the national church into competing sects without centralized authority. The Solemn League and Covenant, negotiated between Parliament and Scottish Covenanters during summer and autumn 1643, transformed the strategic situation fundamentally by bringing Scottish military forces into the conflict on Parliament's side in exchange for English commitment to religious reformation. that would bring the English Church into closer alignment with Scottish Presbyterian practice, creating an alliance that would prove militarily decisive in achieving parliamentary victory, while simultaneously generating religious conflicts that would shape English politics for the remainder of the decade and beyond. As the practical implications of the religious settlement promised in the Covenant proved far more divisive than the general language of the agreement had suggested during negotiations. The Scottish decision to intervene militarily in the English conflict reflected both religious commitment to protecting the Presbyterian settlement that Covenanters had achieved through their revolution against Charles's religious innovations and strategic calculations that Royalist victory in England would eventually threaten Scottish independence and the Presbyterian religious establishment, as Charles would inevitably attempt to reverse the Covenanter revolution and reimpose episcopal church government once his English enemies were defeated and he no longer required Scottish acquiescence, making Scottish security dependent on preventing Royalist victory in England. Even though intervention required cooperation with English parliamentarians, whose religious views ranged from Presbyterian through independent to sectarian, positions that many Scots found nearly as objectionable as the episcopacy they had fought to eliminate. The religious terms of the Solemn League and Covenant committed Parliament to reformation of religion in England and Ireland, according to the Word of God and the example of the best reformed churches, language deliberately crafted with sufficient ambiguity to secure English agreement, while Scots understood it to mandate adoption of Presbyterian church government, modelled on Scottish practice, with hierarchy of church courts exercising, discipline over clergy and laity, uniform liturgy, replacing the Book of Common Prayer, and suppression of sectarian diversity that threatened to fragment English Protestantism into competing denominations without centralised religious authority, though English independence interpreted the same language as requiring only general reformed principles that would accommodate congregational autonomy and religious toleration for diverse Protestant groups. The Westminster Assembly of Divines convened by Parliament in 1643 to advise on religious reformation included both Presbyterian and independent divines, representing different positions within English Puritanism, along with Scottish commissioners who participated to ensure that English Reformation aligned with Scottish expectations embodied in the Solemn League and Covenant, producing the Westminster Confession of Faith and associated catechisms and directory for worship that would define Reformed orthodoxy and influence Presbyterian churches throughout the English-speaking world, while also revealing through years of contentious debates the deep divisions between those who sought comprehensive national church under Presbyterian discipline, exercised through church courts, and those who advocated congregational independence, allowing each church to govern itself without submission to centralized ecclesiastical authority, divisions that parliamentary politics and military developments would ultimately resolve in favour of toleration rather than uniformity. The entry of the Scottish army into northern England in January 1644, numbering approximately 20,000 men, under the experienced commander Alexander Leslie, Earl of Leven, who had served in continental wars and led Covenanter forces during the Bishops' Wars, immediately altered the military balance by threatening Royalist control of the north and forcing redeployment of forces to contain the Scottish advance, relieving pressure on parliamentary forces in other theatres, while creating conditions for the coordinated operations that would characterise the 1644 campaign and ultimately produce the decisive victory at Marston Moor that would eliminate Royalist military power in the north. The Siege of York, beginning in April 1644, conducted by combined Scottish, Parliamentary and Yorkshire forces under Leven, the Earl of Manchester and Sir Thomas Fairfax, converging on the city from different directions and establishing siege lines that cut off supplies and communications while preparing for either starvation, to force surrender, or assault to take the city by storm, represented the first major joint operation of the Anglo-Scottish alliance and threatened to eliminate Royalist power in the north by capturing the region's principal city, the Earl of Newcastle's headquarters, and the strategic position that controlled communications between Scotland and the Royalist territories in the Midlands and South, making relief of the city essential for preserving any royalist presence north of the Trent. Prince Rupert's march to relieve York in June 1644, gathering forces from various royalist garrisons in Lancashire, Cheshire, and the Northern Midlands, while manoeuvring skillfully through hostile territory to approach York from the west and northwest, while avoiding the besieging armies that outnumbered his relief force, demonstrated his exceptional military abilities, including strategic vision, rapid movement, and tactical deception that enabled him to accomplish what appeared impossible by raising the siege and entering York with his army intact, though his subsequent decision to fight battle immediately rather than consolidating his position would prove disastrous for the Royalist cause. The Battle of Marston Moor, fought on the evening of July 2, 1644, on moorland, north of York, when Rupert's relief of the siege and the withdrawal of the besieging armies to prevent being trapped between York's garrison and the relief force led to engagement between combined Parliamentary and Scottish forces numbering perhaps 27,000 men and approximately 18,000 Royalists, in what would prove the largest and most decisive battle of the civil wars, began late in the day, when both sides had apparently decided to postpone battle until the following morning. But Parliamentary forces launched surprise attack that caught Royalists unprepared, initiating evening battle that would continue into darkness and would destroy Royalist military power in the north through a combination of superior Allied numbers, the discipline and tactical skill of the Eastern Association cavalry under Oliver Cromwell that broke Royalist cavalry on the Parliamentary left wing and then wheeled inward to attack Royalist infantry in the centre from the flank and rear, and the eventual coordination of the three Allied armies, despite initial confusion and near disaster, when Rupert's cavalry broke parts of the Allied line and threatened to rout the Scottish and Parliamentary forces before. Cromwell's cavalry intervention restored the situation and transformed initial Allied difficulties into crushing victory. The Parliamentary and Scottish victory at Marston Moor resulted from several factors operating in combination to produce decisive outcome, despite Royalist advantages in position and the quality of their cavalry under Rupert's personal command, including the Allied numerical superiority that allowed them to overlap Royalist flanks and to maintain reserves that could restore broken formations or exploit tactical opportunities, the exceptional performance of Cromwell's Eastern Association cavalry that combined aggressive charges with maintenance of discipline and cohesion, allowing them to rally and re-engage rather than pursuing broken enemies from the battlefield as Rupert's cavalry had done at Edgehill, the effectiveness of Scottish infantry that held firm despite initial setbacks and eventually contributed to the defeat of Royalist infantry in the centre, and the coordination achieved among the three Allied commanders, despite their different nationalities, religious perspectives, and military traditions that might have prevented effective cooperation. The consequences of Marston Moor proved strategically decisive for the Northern Theatre, as the destruction of much of the Royalist Northern Army, with casualties including thousands killed and captured, along with loss of artillery, ammunition, and supplies, combined with the subsequent surrender of York and the Earl of Newcastle's departure into exile, having concluded that further resistance was futile, eliminated the king's military position north of the Midlands and transferred control of the strategically and economically important northern counties to Parliament and the Scots, though Newcastle's survival with some forces that retreated to remaining Royalist strongholds and the Royalist retention of a few garrisons, including Pontefract, prevented complete collapse, while demonstrating that even decisive battlefield victory did not immediately produce total control over affected territories if defenders retained fortified positions and determination to continue resistance. The prominence achieved by Oliver Cromwell through his cavalry's decisive performance at Marston Moor brought to wider attention a figure whose military abilities, religious convictions, and political skills would prove central to Parliament's ultimate victory and to the revolutionary developments that followed the king's defeat, as contemporaries recognised that Cromwell possessed exceptional talents for military command, including tactical skill, ability to train and discipline troops, personal courage that inspired soldiers, while also maintaining control during the chaos of battle, and strategic vision that understood how tactical victories could be translated into broader strategic advantage, while his religious commitment to godly reformation and his political support for more aggressive prosecution of the war placed him increasingly at odds with conservative parliamentary leaders, including his commanding officer Manchester, who Cromwell would soon accuse of insufficient commitment to achieving complete victory. The Second Battle of Newbury, fought in late October 1644, when 3 parliamentary armies under Essex, Manchester, and Sir William Waller attempted coordinated attacks on Royalist positions, defending the approaches to the King's capital at Oxford, demonstrated the continuing problems facing parliamentary forces despite the decisive victory at Marston Moor, as the attempt to overwhelm Royalist defences through simultaneous assaults from different directions failed to achieve the decisive victory that numerical superiority suggested should have been possible, with Manchester's forces arriving late to their designated attack position, allowing Royalists to concentrate against Waller's assault, and preventing the coordination that the battle plan had required, leading to inconclusive fighting that allowed the King to withdraw his forces intact, and to recriminations among parliamentary commanders about whether missed opportunities resulted from military incompetence or from insufficient commitment to pursuing complete victory over the King. The political tensions within the parliamentary coalition that surfaced following Second Newbury reflected fundamental divisions about war aims that had been suppressed during the period when Royalist military success threatened parliamentary survival, but now emerged openly as parliamentary victories created possibilities for negotiated settlement, with some members, including Manchester and other peers, hoping for accommodation that would restore the King to power, with limited concessions regarding church, government, and constitutional issues that would preserve traditional social hierarchies and monarchical institutions while addressing the grievances that had precipitated civil war, while others, including Cromwell and radical members of the Commons, believed that only complete military victory followed by substantial limitations on royal power and thoroughgoing religious reformation could secure the gains for which Parliament had fought and prevent future conflicts, when Charles inevitably attempted to reverse concessions made under military pressure. The self-denying ordinance, introduced in December 1644, initially as proposal from Zouch Tate, and finally passed in modified form in April 1645, after months of political manoeuvring, required members of both houses of Parliament to resign their military commands within 40 days, ostensibly to ensure that military decisions were made on purely military grounds without political considerations, and to address public concerns about members profiting from positions while constituents suffered from war burdens, but actually designed to remove commanders like Essex and Manchester, whose political conservatism and military caution appeared to prevent decisive action against Royalist forces, while also reflecting the Commons' desire to reduce the influence of peers whose social status had provided them with military commands, despite insufficient military ability or commitment to achieving complete victory. The new model army created in early 1645 through ordinance that consolidated various parliamentary armies into a single force of approximately 22,000 men, consisting of 12 regiments of horse, 12 regiments of foot, and 1 regiment of dragoons, represented Parliament's attempt to create a professional military force with unified command structure, regular pay, funded through systematic national taxation, rather than depending on local contributions, promotion based on merit, and demonstrated military ability rather than social status alone, and administration, through centralized war office that could coordinate logistics, ensure adequate supply, and maintain discipline through consistent application of military justice, establishing the military instrument that would prove decisive in achieving parliamentary victory, while also creating an army whose political influence would shape England's revolutionary transformation during the late 1640s. Sir Thomas Fairfax's appointment as Lord General of the new model army provided military leadership from a commander with proven battlefield effectiveness, demonstrated through campaigns in the north, including his role at Marston Moor, Presbyterian religious sympathies that made him acceptable to the parliamentary majority that desired establishment of Presbyterian church government, and noble status that provided social prestige, while his relatively junior position in the peerage and his lack of involvement in parliamentary political factions made him less threatening to Commons members suspicious of aristocratic military commanders, though his willingness to cooperate with the army's increasingly radical political tendencies would later create tensions with conservative Presbyterians who had supported his appointment, expecting him to maintain parliamentary authority over military forces. Oliver Cromwell's exemption from the self-denying ordinance through temporary commissions that were repeatedly renewed, and his appointment as Lieutenant General of Horse, commanding the new model army's cavalry, recognized his indispensable military abilities, demonstrated at Marston Moor and subsequent engagements, while also reflecting his growing political influence among members who believed that only aggressive military leadership combined with religious reformation and resistance to premature accommodation with the king could achieve the goals for which Parliament had fought, creating command structure that combined Fairfax's overall authority with Cromwell's tactical brilliance and his influence over the army's increasingly radical officers and soldiers. The religious and political composition of the new model army included many officers and soldiers with strong religious convictions, rooted in independent and sectarian Protestantism that emphasized personal conversion experiences, direct divine inspiration, and rejection of Presbyterian church discipline that would subordinate individual congregations to centralized ecclesiastical authority, creating an army whose morale and discipline derived partly from belief that it fought for religious truth and national preservation against popish tyranny and arbitrary government, though the extent of radicalism within the army's ranks would only become fully apparent after the war's conclusion, when military victory removed the unifying purpose of defeating Royalist forces and exposed divisions about the religious and political settlement that should follow parliamentary success. The spring campaign of 1645 commenced with Royalist forces under Charles and Rupert, operating in the Midlands, attempting to coordinate with Royalist forces in the West and to relieve strongholds under parliamentary siege while avoiding decisive battle against the new model army, whose superiority in numbers, supply, and organisation made engagement risky unless Royalists could achieve tactical advantage through choice of ground or surprise, while the new model army under Fairfax initially conducted siege operations against Oxford, attempting to capture the king's wartime capital and thereby eliminate the Royalist administrative centre and the symbolic seat of royal authority, though strategic considerations, including the need to respond to Royalist movements and pressure from the Committee of Both Kingdoms, directing parliamentary war effort, soon forced abandonment of the Oxford siege in favour of pursuing King's Field Army. The storming of Leicester by Royalist forces in late May 1645, capturing a parliamentary stronghold through assault that overwhelmed the town's defences after brief siege, and allowed several hours of plunder by Royalist soldiers before officers could restore discipline, demonstrated that Royalists retained significant military capability despite their defeats in 1644 and the creation of the new model army, while the capture provided Charles with a fortified town that could serve as base for further operations and access to supplies and potential recruits in the East Midlands. Though the strategic value of holding Leicester proved limited, as it exposed Royalist forces to attack by superior parliamentary forces while consuming resources and garrison duties that reduced the field army's strength. The decision by Fairfax and the Committee of Both Kingdoms directing parliamentary strategy to abandon the Oxford siege and to pursue the Royalist army actively, rather than continuing to reduce Royalist strongholds while allowing the King's Field Army to operate freely, led to the decisive engagement at Naseby, in Northamptonshire, on June 14, when approximately 14,000 new model army soldiers confronted about 9,000 Royalists in battle that would effectively end Royalist hopes of military victory and demonstrate the tactical and organisational superiority that Parliament had achieved through military reforms implemented over the previous year. The Battle of Naseby followed tactical patterns established at Marston Moor, with initial Royalist cavalry success under Rupert on the Royale, St. Right Wing, breaking the parliamentary cavalry, opposing them, and pursuing the routed enemy from the battlefield, thereby removing themselves from the decisive phase of the battle. offset by Cromwell's cavalry victory on the Parliamentary right that broke Royalist cavalry through combination of superior numbers and disciplined attack, followed by maintenance of formation, allowing rallying and re-engagement, followed by disciplined Parliamentary cavalry's return to the main battlefield to engage Royalist infantry that had been advancing successfully against Parliamentary foot in the centre, attacking from flank and rear, while Parliamentary infantry that had been giving ground rallied and resumed offensive, ultimately breaking Royalist infantry resistance through coordinated attacks from multiple directions and transforming tactical advantage into crushing victory that destroyed much of the King's field army, killed or captured thousands of Royalist soldiers, and seized the King's baggage train, including personal correspondence that would prove politically damaging when published by Parliament, to demonstrate Charles's duplicity and his negotiations to bring Irish Catholic forces and continental Catholic troops to England in violation of his public commitments to maintaining Protestant religion and English liberties. The Royalist collapse following Naseby proceeded with remarkable speed through summer and autumn 1645, as Parliamentary forces under Fairfax and other commanders systematically reduced Royalist strongholds throughout the West, the Midlands, and Wales, while the King's remaining field forces proved incapable of offering effective resistance or preventing the piecemeal elimination of Royalist territorial control, with the Western Royalist army under Lord Goring suffering decisive defeat at Langport in Somerset in July, where Fairfax's forces attacked and overwhelmed Royalist positions despite difficult terrain and initial defence advantages, eliminating organised Royalist resistance in the southwest and opening the way for Parliamentary operations against Bristol and other major Royalist strongholds in the region. The capture of Bristol in September 1645 after siege operations, followed by coordinated assault that overwhelmed the city's extensive fortifications through attacks from multiple directions, despite determined resistance from the Royalist garrison under Prince Rupert, demonstrated the new model army's capabilities in siege warfare and combined operations, while also eliminating the Royalist capital in the west, the King's most important port providing access to supplies and potential reinforcement from Ireland or the continent, and the strategic position controlling the Severn estuary and communications between Wales and southwestern England. Though Rupert's surrender of the city after resistance that Charles considered insufficient led to bitter recriminations between uncle and nephew, and Rupert's dismissal from Royalist service, despite his previous invaluable contributions to the King's military efforts. The capture of the King's correspondence at Naseby provided Parliament with documentary evidence that Charles had been negotiating to bring Irish Catholic forces, soldiers released from Confederate Catholic service in Ireland through cessation agreement that suspended fighting between Protestant Royalist forces and Catholic Confederates, and potentially continental Catholic troops from France or Spanish Netherlands to England to fight against Parliament, correspondence that confirmed parliamentary propaganda about the King's involvement in Catholic conspiracy to overthrow English Protestantism and impose arbitrary government, while undermining Royalist claims that they fought to preserve the established Protestant Church against parliamentary innovation and sectarian disorder, enabling Parliament to publish the King's letters, demonstrating his duplicity and his willingness to ally with Catholics against English Protestants in ways that damaged Royalist support among populations that might have been willing to support legitimate monarchy, but recoiled from a king who would betray English Protestant interests for Catholic military assistance. The strategic options available to Charles narrowed dramatically by autumn 1645, as the territories under effective Royalist control shrank to isolated garrisons scattered throughout Wales, the southwest, and parts of the Midlands, limited areas in Wales and the far west, where Royalist forces could still operate without immediate threat of parliamentary attack, and a few remaining strongholds including Oxford, Worcester, and Newark, whose fortifications and determined garrisons enabled them to resist parliamentary siege operations, while the new model army's systematic reduction of Royalist fortified positions through siege operations that combined blockade, preventing resupply with artillery bombardment and preparation for assault, demonstrated that even strong, defensive works could not withstand sustained operations by properly equipped and supplied forces, supported by siege train and engineering expertise. The final major Royalist field army's destruction at Stow-on-the-Wold in March 1646, when Lord Astley's force of approximately 3,000 men marching from the west to join the king at Oxford, intercepted and defeated by Parliamentary forces, eliminating any possibility of continued field operations by organised Royalist armies, and leaving Charles with no viable military option except negotiation or flight, though his continuing belief that divisions among his enemies might still be exploited to achieve acceptable settlement, and his conviction that Providence would ultimately vindicate his cause, led him to attempt diplomatic manoeuvring between Scottish, English parliamentary, and Irish interests, rather than accepting the reality of complete military defeat. Charles's decision to surrender to the Scottish army, besieging Newark in May 1646, rather than to English parliamentary forces, reflected his calculation that the Scots' commitment to monarchy and their desire to achieve the religious settlement promised in the Solemn League and Covenant might make them more amenable to moderate terms than the English Parliament, where radical religious and political voices were gaining influence. The First Civil War's conclusion left Parliament victorious, but facing enormous problems, including a massive war debt, demands for pay and indemnity from armies that had served its cause, religious divisions between Presbyterians seeking a comprehensive national church and independents advocating broader toleration, and political questions about what constitutional settlement could be achieved with a defeated king who retained the loyalty of significant portions of the population and whose cooperation seemed necessary for any legitimate government. The Treaty of Newcastle negotiations conducted between Charles and commissioners from the English and Scottish parliaments during summer and autumn 1646 revealed the king's continuing resistance to accepting substantial and limitations on royal power or permanent establishment of Presbyterian church government, as he employed delay and evasion, hoping that time would increase divisions among his enemies while improving his bargaining position. The Scottish army's withdrawal from England in early 1647, after receiving payment of arrears owed for their service and transferring custody of Charles to English parliamentary commissioners, marked the end of the Anglo-Scottish alliance that had proved decisive in defeating the king, though Scottish interest in English affairs would remain significant and intervention would recur when developments in England threatened Scottish interests. The political situation in England during 1647 grew increasingly complex, as the Presbyterian majority in Parliament sought to disband much of the new model army without adequately addressing soldiers' grievances about pay, arrears and indemnity for actions taken during the war, while also pursuing settlement with the king, based on establishment of Presbyterian church government and limited constraints on royal power that would restore Charles to substantive authority. The new model army's resistance to disbandment without satisfaction of material grievances, combined with religious and political concerns among soldiers and officers who feared that the parliamentary Presbyterian settlement betray the cause for which they had fought, creating an unprecedented situation where a victorious army refused to disband at the direction of the political authority that had created it, and remained in arms as an independent political force. The army's politicization during spring and summer 1647 proceeded through the development of representative structures, including elected agitators from each regiment and a general council of the army, and soldier representatives, creating mechanisms for collective deliberation about political and religious questions that transformed the new model from a military instrument into a revolutionary political movement. The seizure of the king from parliamentary custody by Cornet Joyce and a party of cavalry in June 1647, conducted with at least tacit approval from senior officers, including Cromwell and Fairfax, gave the army control over Charles's person and direct involvement in negotiations regarding constitutional settlement, removing Parliament's exclusive authority over treating with the king. The heads of proposals, drafted by Commissary General Henry Ireton and other army leaders in July 1647, offered Charles terms significantly more moderate than Parliament's Newcastle propositions, including limited religious reform that would maintain bishops while reducing their power, biennial parliaments, and restoration of substantial royal authority after a brief period of parliamentary control, reflecting the army leadership's conservative constitutional thinking and desire to achieve settlement that would allow military disbandment. The radical political ferment within London and the army during summer 1647 produced demands for more extensive reforms, including dramatic expansion of the franchise, greater social and economic equality, and limitations on aristocratic and monarchical power that far exceeded anything the army leadership or Parliament had contemplated, with these ideas articulated most clearly by the Leveller movement that had emerged from London's radical religious congregations and the army's radicalised soldiers. The Putney debates conducted within the General Council of the Army during October and November 1647 witnessed extraordinary discussions about fundamental political questions, including the nature of political obligation, the source of governmental authority, and the proper extent of the franchise, with Leveller representatives arguing that natural rights and popular consent should determine political arrangements, while senior officers defended property qualifications and existing social hierarchies as essential for political stability. The arguments advanced at Putney by Colonel Thomas Rainsborough that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live, as the greatest he, and therefore should have voice in choosing governments, reflected radical egalitarian principles that challenged not only monarchy, but also the oligarchic parliamentary rule that the gentry who dominated the Commons represented, articulating democratic ideas that would not achieve practical implementation for 2 centuries. The army leadership's suppression of the Leveller-inspired mutinies at Corkbush Field in November 1647, executing one ringleader and dispersing the regiments that had demonstrated most sympathy for radical political ideas, demonstrated that Cromwell and other senior officers would employ force to maintain military discipline and prevent the army's transformation into an instrument for social revolution that would threaten property rights and established social hierarchies. Charles's escape from army custody at Hampton Court in November 1647 and flight to the Isle of Wight, where he became prisoner of the island's governor, Colonel Robert Hammond, resulted from the king's alarm at discussions within the army, including reports of proposals to bring him to trial, though his new confinement proved as secure as his previous custody, while removing him further from direct army control. The engagement secretly negotiated between Charles and Scottish commissioners in December 1647 committed the Scots to invade England, to restore the king in exchange for Charles's agreement to establish Presbyterianism in England for 3 years, and to suppress the independents and sectaries whose influence in the new model army threatened both monarchy and the religious settlement that Scotland desired, creating conditions for the Second Civil War that would erupt in spring 1648. The Second Civil War that commenced in spring 1648 differed fundamentally from the first in consisting primarily of localised uprisings by Royalist sympathisers and former parliamentarians disillusioned with the political and religious directions that parliamentary victory had taken, coordinated with Scottish invasion in support of the king, as agreed in the engagement, rather than sustained regional campaigns by established armies. The risings in Wales, Kent, and Essex during May and June 1648 reflected combinations of Royalist commitment, Presbyterian opposition to the independent-dominated army and its religious toleration, resentment of taxation and military rule, and calculations that Scottish intervention might enable successful restoration of the king. But the localised and uncoordinated nature of these uprisings allowed the new model army to suppress them systematically before the Scottish invasion materialised. Fairfax's siege and storming of Colchester, where Royalist forces from the Kentish Rising had concentrated after defeat at Maidstone, demonstrated the army's determination to crush Royalist resistance decisively, with the execution of Royalist commanders after the town's surrender in August, indicating that the army leadership viewed the Second Civil War as inexcusable rebellion by those who had violated their previous defeat and parole. The Scottish invasion of northwest England in July 1648, led by the Duke of Hamilton, with an army of perhaps 20,000 men, implementing the engagement despite opposition from radical Covenanters, who opposed alliance with an uncovenanted king, represented the most serious military threat of the Second Civil War, though poor organisation, divided command, and inadequate supplies undermined Scottish military effectiveness. Cromwell's campaign against the Scottish invasion demonstrated his military genius through rapid movement from Wales, where he had been suppressing risings to northern England, where he concentrated forces and attacked the Scottish army at Preston in mid-August, achieving crushing victory through aggressive tactics that exploited Scottish dispersion and poor coordination, destroying Scottish military power and eliminating the last significant threat to parliamentary control. The political impact of the Second Civil War proved even more significant than its military course, as the renewed conflict convinced many in the army that Charles's duplicity and willingness to plunge the nation into renewed bloodshed demonstrated that no settlement could be achieved that included his restoration to power, leading to demands for bringing the king to justice for the blood spilled in wars he had caused. The army's remonstrance presented to Parliament in November 1648 demanded that Charles be brought to trial for treason, that those who had supported the Second Civil War be punished, and that Parliament take steps to establish a more representative government, reflecting the army's conviction that the existing Parliament had betrayed the cause, and that revolutionary measures were necessary to prevent restoration of tyranny. Parliament's continued negotiations with Charles at Newport on the Isle of Wight during autumn 1648, pursuing settlement that would restore the king with limited concessions regarding religious and constitutional issues, demonstrated that the Presbyterian majority remained committed to achieving accommodation with monarchy, despite the king's evident unwillingness to accept substantial limitations and his responsibility for renewing civil war. The army's determination to prevent the Newport negotiations from producing settlement that would restore Charles led to Colonel Pride's purge of Parliament on December 6, 1648, when soldiers under Pride's command stationed at the House of Commons prevented about 140 members from taking their seats while arresting 45 others, leaving a rump of approximately 200 members willing to cooperate with the army's demands for bringing the king to justice. The rump parliament that remained after Pride's purge, dominated by independents and members committed to preventing Charles's restoration, represented a revolutionary transformation of parliamentary legitimacy, as the army had employed force to alter the composition of England's supreme legislative body, creating a parliament that derived its authority from military power rather than from elections or constitutional continuity. The establishment of the High Court of Justice in January 1649 to try Charles Stuart for treason represented a revolutionary act without precedent in English history, as the traditional understanding that the king could do no wrong and that treason consisted of offences against the king made the concept of a king committing treason conceptually incoherent within existing legal frameworks. The court's composition of 135 commissioners, nominated by the rump, including army officers, members of parliament, and some gentry willing to participate in the unprecedented proceedings, revealed that many potential judges refused to serve in trying the king, recognizing the revolutionary nature of the proceedings and fearing future retribution if monarchy were restored. John Bradshaw, the lawyer selected to preside over the court, directed proceedings from behind a desk while wearing a specially reinforced hat, supposedly protection against assassination, symbolizing both the perceived danger of the proceedings and the determination of those conducting them to bring the king to account, despite fears about consequences. Charles's refusal to recognize the court's legitimacy or to enter a plea to the charges represented his conviction that no earthly power could legitimately judge a monarch whose authority derived from God, and his dignified bearing throughout the trial created sympathy even among some who had opposed him during the wars, as he appeared as a king defending monarchical principle against revolutionary innovations. The charges against Charles accused him of responsibility for the war's bloodshed through his attempt to establish arbitrary and tyrannical government, claiming that he had levied war against Parliament and the kingdom, though the legal reasoning that a king could be guilty of treason against his own subjects inverted traditional understanding of political authority and criminal law. The presentation of evidence during the trial focused on Charles's military actions and his correspondence captured at Naseby, revealing negotiations to bring foreign and Irish forces against Parliament, establishing his personal responsibility for continuing the wars while avoiding more abstract arguments about constitutional theory that might have proven difficult to sustain. The court's inevitable guilty verdict and sentence of death reached on January 27, 1649, condemned Charles to be executed as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy, employing the most extreme language to justify an act that had no precedent in English history and that would be viewed by many, both in England and throughout Europe, as shocking violation of divinely ordained political order. The execution of Charles I on January 30, 1649, carried out on a scaffold erected outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, before crowds that had gathered to witness the unprecedented spectacle, demonstrated the revolutionary regime's determination to proceed with regicide, despite the political and religious horror that many felt at the killing of an anointed monarch. Charles's demeanour on the scaffold, maintaining royal dignity and presenting himself as a martyr, dying for the laws and liberties of England, as well as for the Protestant religion properly understood, proved effective as his final speech, and courageous death created powerful Royalist propaganda that would shape memory of the Civil War and Commonwealth period. The immediate aftermath of the regicide witnessed varied reactions ranging from shock and horror among many who had opposed Charles during the wars, but had not desired his death, to determined support from the army and radical independents who viewed the execution as necessary judgment on a tyrant, to calculations about how to navigate the new political landscape created by elimination of monarchy. The abolition of monarchy by Act of Parliament in March 1649 declared that the office of king was unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous to the liberty, safety, and public interest of the people, formally ending more than 1,000 years of monarchical government in England and creating a constitutional void that would need to be filled by new institutions and arrangements. The abolition of the House of Lords in the same period removed the aristocratic element from Parliament, leaving the Commons as sole legislative authority, though this Commons represented only those members who had remained after Pride's purge and possessed questionable legitimacy as representative institution, given the circumstances of its creation. The Commonwealth government established in 1649, following the abolition of monarchy and the House of Lords, rested on the authority of the purged House of Commons, renamed the Parliament of the Commonwealth of England, and a Council of State elected by Parliament to exercise executive functions previously belonging to the Crown, creating an constitutional experiment in republican government that would persist until 1653. The Commonwealth's international position proved immediately problematic, as European monarchies refused to recognise a regime that had executed a king and established republican government, viewing England as a dangerous source of revolutionary contamination that threatened the monarchical principle throughout Europe, while English diplomats found themselves unwelcome at foreign courts, and English trade suffered from hostile reception in many ports. The military challenges facing the Commonwealth proved more immediate than diplomatic isolation, as Royalist resistance persisted in Ireland and Scotland, where Charles II had been proclaimed king following his father's execution, requiring military campaigns to establish Commonwealth control over territories that had been part of the Stuart kingdoms. The Irish campaign led by Cromwell from August 1649 to May 1650 employed systematic brutality to crush Royalist and Confederate Catholic resistance, with the storming of Drogheda and Wexford, resulting in massacres of garrisons and civilians that exceeded normal contemporary military practice, even against fortified positions that had refused to surrender, establishing patterns of English rule in Ireland that would shape Anglo-Irish relations for centuries. The military effectiveness of Cromwell's campaign in Ireland resulted from the new model army's professional discipline, adequate supply, supported by English naval control of the Irish Sea, and ruthless willingness to employ terror to to break resistance, with the massacres at Drogheda and Wexford deliberately intended to encourage other garrisons to surrender rather than face similar fates. The land confiscations that followed the Commonwealth's conquest of Ireland, seizing estates from Catholic landowners and those who had supported the Royalist cause to pay soldiers and investors who had financed the campaign, represented the most extensive transfer of property in Irish history and established Protestant landowning dominance that would persist until the 20th century. The Scottish response to the English Republic proved more complex than Irish resistance, as the radical Covenanters who had opposed the engagement and Hamilton's invasion maintained hostility to Charles II's uncovenanted monarchy, while also rejecting English Republican government as violation of the Solemn League, Covenant's commitment to monarchical government, creating divisions within Scotland that the Commonwealth would exploit. Charles II's arrival in Scotland in June 1650 and his acceptance of the Covenant to secure Scottish support for his restoration created an uneasy alliance between a king who accepted Presbyterianism from necessity rather than of conviction, and Scottish Covenanters who distrusted his commitment while viewing him as preferable to English Republican government. Cromwell's invasion of Scotland in July 1650, leading an army of approximately 16,000 men to prevent Scottish support for Charles II from threatening the Commonwealth, encountered initial difficulties as Scottish forces under David Leslie avoided battle while employing scorched earth tactics that left the invading army short of supplies and afflicted by disease. The Battle of Dunbar, fought on September 3, 1650, when Leslie's larger Scottish army abandoned its strong defensive position to attack Cromwell's weakened force, resulted in crushing English victory as Cromwell's tactical skill and his soldiers' superior discipline and firepower destroyed Scottish resistance, killing or capturing perhaps 10,000 Scots while suffering minimal casualties, demonstrating again Cromwell's military genius while establishing English dominance over southern Scotland. The Scottish defeat at Dunbar and subsequent English occupation of Edinburgh eliminated the Covenanter regime that had ruled Scotland since 1638, though Royalist and Presbyterian resistance continued in the Highlands, and Charles II maintained his claim to the Scottish throne from his refuge in northern Scotland, where he prepared for invasion of England. Charles II's invasion of England in August 1651, leading a predominantly Scottish army of approximately 16,000 men south through the western route, while Cromwell's forces remained concentrated in Scotland, represented the last significant Royalist military challenge to the Commonwealth, based on calculations that English Royalists would rise to support the king and that Cromwell would be unable to prevent the Scottish army from reaching London. The failure of English Royalists to provide the expected support as Charles's army marched south demonstrated that years of defeat, confiscations, and composition fines had broken Royalist capacity for military resistance, while the Commonwealth's control of strategic positions and garrison forces prevented coordination between Scottish invaders and potential English supporters. Cromwell's pursuit of Charles's army from Scotland to the Midlands, covering great distances with remarkable speed while gathering forces from garrisons throughout northern and central England, demonstrated both his understanding of strategic requirements and his ability to organise rapid troop movements, concentrating approximately 30,000 men to confront the Scottish army that had reached Worcester by early September. The Battle of Worcester, fought on September 3, 1651, exactly 1 year after Dunbar, proved the final decisive engagement of the civil wars as Cromwell's forces attacked the city from multiple directions, overwhelming Scottish defensive positions through superior numbers, coordination, and firepower that the exhausted and outnumbered Scottish army could not resist, destroying the last Royalist field army and scattering its remnants. Charles II's escape from Worcester and his subsequent flight to France, accomplished through 6 weeks of hiding in safe houses and disguising himself as a servant, included the famous incident of concealing himself in an oak tree while Parliamentary soldiers searched the grounds, creating Royalist legends that would sustain monarchist sentiment during the interregnum, while Charles himself learned harsh lessons about the realities of defeat and exile. The Commonwealth's military victories in Ireland and Scotland by late 1651 established English republican control over the entire British Isles for the first time, eliminating Royalist military threats, while creating administrative challenges of governing hostile populations in Ireland and Scotland, where English rule rested primarily on military force rather than consent or traditional legitimacy. The Rump Parliament's governance of the Commonwealth from 1649 to 1653 proceeded through committees and the Council of State, addressing the enormous practical challenges of maintaining military forces, managing confiscated estates, collecting revenue, and conducting diplomacy, while also confronting religious controversies and political divisions within the parliamentary coalition that had defeated the king. The religious settlement attempted during the Commonwealth period abolished the Book of Common Prayer and Episcopal Church government, while establishing a more tolerant system that allowed Presbyterian, Independent, and Baptist congregations to coexist with minimal state supervision, though radical sectaries including Quakers, Ranters, and Fifth Monarchists, who challenged social hierarchies and prophesied imminent divine intervention, faced hostility and occasional persecution. The army's growing frustration with the Rump Parliament intensified during 1652 and early 1653, as the Parliament appeared to perpetuate its own power without establishing procedures for new elections or substantial constitutional reforms, leading officers to conclude that the Parliament they had preserved through military victories was betraying the cause for which the wars had been fought. The economic policies pursued by the Commonwealth included the Navigation Act of 1651, requiring that goods imported to England or its colonies be carried in English ships or ships of the producing country, targeting Dutch commercial dominance while promoting English maritime interests, and contributing to the outbreak of war with the Dutch Republic in 1652. The First Anglo-Dutch War, beginning in 1652, emerged from commercial competition, maritime disputes, and ideological tensions between the English Commonwealth and the Dutch Republic, both Protestant republics but rivals for naval supremacy and commercial advantage, producing a series of naval battles that demonstrated English naval capabilities while straining Commonwealth finances. The naval battles between English and Dutch fleets off the English coast and in the Channel during 1652 and 1653, including major engagements at Dungeness, Portland, the Gabbard, and Scheveningen, involved hundreds of warships and thousands of sailors in the largest naval conflicts that had occurred in European waters, establishing the tactical and technological foundations for England's subsequent naval dominance. The expulsion of the Rump Parliament on April 20, 1653, when Cromwell led soldiers into the House of Commons and forcibly dissolved the Assembly after learning that members planned to pass legislation perpetuating their own power, represented a military coup against the civil authority that Cromwell and the army had previously claimed to serve, justified by the argument that Parliament had betrayed its trust and that military intervention was necessary to prevent entrenchment of an oligarchy that served its own interests rather than the public good. The nominated Assembly, or bare-bones Parliament, summoned by the Council of Officers in July 1653, represented an experiment in godly rule through selection of 140 members chosen for their religious commitment and reforming zeal, rather than through traditional electoral processes, reflecting the army leadership's conviction that conventional politics had failed and that power should be entrusted to the godly who would implement thoroughgoing reformation. The composition of the nominated assembly included independent and Baptist members committed to religious toleration and social reform, but also radical Fifth Monarchists who believed that Christ's return was imminent and that governmental structures should be reformed to prepare for the divine kingdom, creating a body too divided and radical to govern effectively. The brief session of the nominated assembly from July to December 1653 witnessed proposals for extensive legal reform, including abolition of chancery, reform of the tithe system supporting clergy, and simplification of law that alarmed conservatives, including army officers who feared that social and economic changes would threaten property rights and established hierarchies, leading to growing conviction among moderates that the experiment in godly rule was producing chaos rather than reformation. The voluntary dissolution of the nominated assembly in December 1653, when moderate members voted to surrender their authority to Cromwell after radical members had temporarily absented themselves, resulted from calculations that constitutional government required more traditional structures and that Cromwell's personal authority offered the best prospect for maintaining order while continuing reform within bounds that would not threaten fundamental property rights or social stability. The instrument of government adopted in December 1653 created the Protectorate, with Cromwell as Lord Protector exercising executive authority, while a Council of State provided advice and consent for major decisions, and a Parliament elected triennially would legislate and approve taxation, establishing England's first written constitution and creating governmental structures that combined elements of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic governance. Cromwell's acceptance of the position of Lord Protector represented his recognition that England required governmental stability and constitutional structures that possessed legitimacy beyond military force, though his assumption of quasi-monarchical authority disappointed radical elements in the army, who had hoped the revolution would produce more egalitarian political arrangements. The Protectorate's governmental structure under the instrument of government distributed power among Protector, Council, and Parliament in ways designed to prevent any element from exercising arbitrary authority, requiring Protector and Council to govern between parliamentary sessions while Parliament controlled taxation and legislation, though the precise boundaries of these powers remained ambiguous and would prove contentious. The first Protectorate Parliament, elected in 1654, under provisions of the instrument of government, included many members hostile to the Protectorate and to religious toleration, leading to conflicts over the constitutional settlement and demands for greater parliamentary authority that Cromwell found unacceptable, resulting in dissolution after 5 months, when Parliament attempted to alter fundamental features of the instrument of government that Cromwell insisted were beyond parliamentary authority to change. The Major General's experiment implemented in 1655 and 1656, dividing England into 11 districts, each governed by a Major General with extensive authority over militia, moral reformation, and security against Royalist conspiracy, represented Cromwell's attempt to establish effective government and promote godly reformation without relying on parliamentary cooperation, though the system's association with military rule and intrusive moral regulation made it deeply unpopular. The decimation tax imposed on Royalist estates to fund the Major Generals provided resources for the system, while also punishing those who had supported the king. Though the arbitrary nature of assessments and the perception of military despotism intensified opposition to the Protectorate among substantial property owners who had initially supported Parliament against Charles I. The Penruddock Rising in March 1655, an attempted Royalist insurrection in Wiltshire that was quickly suppressed by government forces, demonstrated both the persistence of Royalist sentiment and the effectiveness of the Protectorate's military control, while also providing justification for the Major General system that Cromwell implemented to prevent future conspiracies and to promote moral reformation. The conclusion of the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1654 through the Treaty of Westminster recognised English naval supremacy while requiring the Dutch to accept the Navigation Act and to agree to mechanisms for resolving maritime disputes, establishing England's position as a major naval power while freeing resources that had been absorbed by the expensive naval conflict. The Protectorate's foreign policy under Cromwell combined Protestant ideological commitments with pursuit of commercial advantage and national prestige, leading to alliance with France against Spain, support for Protestant minorities in Catholic territories, and naval operations in the Mediterranean and Caribbean that enhanced English power while straining the Protectorate's finances. The Western Design, launched in 1655, an expedition to the Caribbean, intended to capture Spanish territories and establish English colonies while spreading Protestantism in territories dominated by Catholic Spain, resulted in humiliating failure when the force attempting to capture Hispaniola was defeated, though the subsequent capture of Jamaica provided England with a valuable Caribbean base that would prove economically significant. The Spanish War, beginning in 1656, following the Western Design Expedition, aligned England with France against Spain in the final phase of France's conflict with the Spanish Habsburgs, producing the notable English victory at the Battle of the Dunes in 1658, where English forces fighting alongside French troops defeated Spanish and Royalist exile forces, demonstrating the new model army's continued effectiveness in European warfare. The capture of Dunkirk in 1658 and its transfer to English control provided the Protectorate with a continental base and a significant port, though the costs of maintaining the garrison and the expense of the Spanish War contributed to the Protectorate's chronic financial difficulties. The Second Protectorate Parliament, elected in 1656, after excluding about 100 members whom the council deemed opposed to godly government, witnessed renewed conflicts over the Protectorate's constitutional basis, religious toleration, and the Major General's system. Though this parliament proved somewhat more cooperative than its predecessor in approving taxation and considering constitutional revision, the humble petition and advice presented to Cromwell by Parliament in 1657 proposed substantial constitutional changes, including offering Cromwell the title of king, establishing a second parliamentary chamber, and making the constitution less flexible by requiring parliamentary consent for alterations, representing Parliament's attempt to move the Protectorate toward more traditional and predictable constitutional arrangements. Cromwell's refusal to accept the title of king, despite months of consideration and intense pressure from civilian advisors, reflected both his personal religious convictions about having fought to eliminate tyrannical monarchy and his recognition that accepting the crown would alienate army officers whose support remained essential for the Protectorate's survival, though he accepted other provisions of the humble petition and advice, including the creation of the other house as a second parliamentary chamber. The modified Protectorate constitution, implemented through the humble petition and advice, established governmental structures more similar to traditional English governance, with Protector, other house, and Commons replicating the previous distribution of power among monarch, lords, and commons, though the nominated nature of the other house and the Protector's life tenure distinguished these arrangements from hereditary monarchy and aristocracy. The religious policies of the Protectorate maintained broad toleration for Protestant diversity, while suppressing only the most extreme sectaries and excluding Catholics from public worship, creating space for independent, Presbyterian, and Baptist congregations to coexist peacefully, while also allowing the emergence of new religious movements, including the Quakers, whose rejection of social hierarchies and insistence on direct divine inspiration provoked persecution. Despite general Protectorate commitment to religious liberty, the death of Oliver Cromwell on September 3, 1658, the anniversary of his victories at Dunbar and Worcester, removed the central figure whose military achievements, political skills, and personal authority had held together the Protectorate's diverse and often conflicting elements, creating an immediate succession crisis that would expose the instability of constitutional arrangements that depended so heavily on one individual's abilities and prestige. Richard Cromwell's succession as Lord Protector, according to provisions of the revised Protectorate Constitution, brought to power a man who possessed neither military experience nor his father's political acumen, commanding respect based solely on being Oliver's son, rather than on demonstrated ability to manage the complex religious and political forces that sustained the Protectorate. The Third Protectorate Parliament, summoned by Richard in January 1665, witnessed renewed conflicts between Conservative members, elected to the Commons, who desired more traditional constitutional arrangements, and exclusion of religious radicals, and army officers, who insisted on maintaining the army's political influence and religious toleration, revealing that the tensions Oliver had managed through force of personality remained unresolved. The army's growing dissatisfaction with Richard Cromwell's leadership and with Parliament's attempts to reduce military influence led officers to force Richard to dissolve Parliament in April 1659, eliminating the civilian political authority while demonstrating that the army remained the ultimate source of power within the Protectorate, though this military intervention undermined the constitutional government that the army claimed to protect. Richard Cromwell's resignation as Lord Protector in May 1659, under pressure from army officers who had concluded he could not provide effective leadership, resulted from his inability to reconcile parliamentary and military demands, ending the dynastic succession that the humble petition and advice had attempted to establish while leaving England without clear governmental authority. The Rump Parliament's restoration in May 1659, recalled by army officers seeking to re-establish civil government after Richard's resignation, created the constitutional anomaly of reviving the purged Parliament that had been forcibly dissolved 6 years earlier, returning to power an assembly whose legitimacy was questionable and whose members' political views had been shaped by conflicts that had since been transformed by events. The restored Rump's attempts to assert parliamentary authority over the army by demanding control of military appointments and reducing the army's political influence provoked renewed conflict with officers who insisted that the army's service to the cause entitled it to political voice, and that Parliament's composition, through Pride's purge, made it no more legitimate than the Protectorate had been. The expulsion of the Rump Parliament again in October 1659 by army officers under John Lambert, who objected to Parliament's attempts to reduce military power, demonstrated that the army remained willing to employ force against civilian authority when officers perceived threats to their interests, though this second expulsion discredited military rule and encouraged those seeking constitutional stability to consider alternatives, including restoration of traditional monarchy. The Committee of Safety established by the army after expelling the Rump attempted to provide interim government while developing constitutional proposals, but lacked legitimacy and could not command the obedience of forces stationed in Scotland under George Monk, who refused to recognise the military coup and began marching south to restore parliamentary government. The political chaos during late 1659 created opportunities for Royalist conspiracy and Presbyterian politicians seeking accommodation with Charles II that would restore monarchy with conditions protecting parliamentary privileges and Protestant religious settlement, while also producing a breakdown of governmental authority as various military units, parliamentary factions, and civilian groups competed for power without any commanding the authority necessary to establish stable government. General George Monk's march from Scotland to London with his army during December 1659 and January 1660 proceeded without opposition, as English garrisons chose not to resist a force nominally loyal to Parliament, as civilian populations welcomed military intervention that promised to restore civil government and end the political chaos that had prevailed since Richard Cromwell's fall. Monk's political objectives remained ambiguous during his march, as he maintained contacts with various factions, including the Rump Parliament, excluded Presbyterian members, and Royalist conspirators, carefully avoiding commitments while assessing the political situation and building support for whatever settlement would prove most stable and advantageous. The restoration of the Rump Parliament for the third time in December 1659 occurred when Lambert's support dissolved in the face of Monk's advance, and when London's political leaders refused to continue recognising the Committee of Safety's authority, demonstrating that military rule had lost whatever legitimacy it possessed, and that civilian government required restoration, even through an assembly of questionable constitutional standing. Monk's arrival in London in February 1660 gave him effective control of the capital and the ability to determine England's political future, as the Rump Parliament proved incapable of governing without military support, while other political factions lacked the force necessary to implement their preferred settlements. The readmission of the secluded members, those excluded by Pride's purge in 1648, to Parliament in February 1660, at Monk's direction transformed the Long Parliament's composition by adding Presbyterian members who had opposed regicide and desired accommodation with monarchy, creating a body that could legitimately dissolve itself and order new elections that would determine England's constitutional future. The dissolution of the Long Parliament in March 1660, after more than 19 years of existence, ended the Parliamentary Assembly that had begun meeting in November 1640 and had witnessed the constitutional conflicts, civil wars, regicide, and republican experiments that had transformed England's political landscape, though its final act of calling for new elections and establishing a Council of State to govern during the interim demonstrated continuing commitment to parliamentary governance. The Convention Parliament, elected in April 1660, represented the first free elections since 1640, producing an assembly that included substantial numbers of members favouring restoration of monarchy, alongside former Republicans and Presbyterians seeking constitutional conditions that would protect parliamentary authority and religious settlement. Though the momentum toward restoration proved overwhelming, as no viable alternative commanded sufficient support. Charles II's Declaration of Breda, issued in April 1660, promised religious liberty for tender consciences, pardon for those who had opposed monarchy, except those specifically excluded by Parliament, payment of army arrears, and confirmation of land purchases made during the interregnum subject to parliamentary determination, providing reassurances that encouraged support for restoration while avoiding specific commitments that would constrain the restored monarchy. The Convention's invitation to Charles II to return as king, and its declaration that monarchy was the ancient and fundamental government of England, represented the formal restoration of traditional constitutional arrangements, though the exact powers of the restored monarchy and its relationship to Parliament remain to be determined through subsequent practice and potential conflict. Charles II's return to England in May 1660, landing at Dover and proceeding to London through enthusiastic crowds, celebrating the restoration after years of political instability and military rule, marked the formal conclusion of the Republican experiment and the return to monarchical government that would prove permanent despite subsequent conflicts over the extent of royal power. The euphoria that accompanied the restoration reflected widespread relief at the end of political chaos and military rule, rather than necessarily indicating royalist sentiment among all who celebrated, as many who had supported Parliament against Charles I and had tolerated or supported the Republic, concluded that stable constitutional government required restoration of traditional monarchy with appropriate limitations. The political settlement implemented during 1660 and subsequent years attempted to restore traditional constitutional arrangements, while addressing some of the grievances that had precipitated civil war, though the extent to which the restoration represented genuine compromise or royal victory remained contested as Charles II and Parliament tested the boundaries of their respective authorities. The Convention Parliament's assumption of the title Parliament, despite not being summoned by royal writ, established parliamentary authority to determine its own legitimacy, while also creating constitutional ambiguity about whether this assembly possessed full parliamentary powers or merely acted as interim body, pending regular parliament summoned through traditional procedures. The Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, passed in 1660, pardoned most who had participated in the civil wars and interregnum governments, while specifically accepting regicides and those who had directly participated in Charles I's trial and execution, leading to trials and executions of surviving regicides, including some who had fled to the continent but were captured or returned, while others escaped to New England or the Netherlands where they lived in exile. The exhumation and posthumous execution of Cromwell, Ireton, and Bradshaw, whose bodies were disinterred, hanged at Tyburn, and beheaded with their heads displayed on Westminster Hall, demonstrated the restored regime's determination to punish symbolically those responsible for regicide even when death had placed them beyond earthly justice, satisfying royalist demands for vengeance while also serving as warning against future resistance to royal authority. The religious settlement attempted during 1660 and 1661 proved more contentious than constitutional arrangements, as competing visions of church governance and worship divided those who had supported restoration, with Anglicans desiring full restoration of episcopal government and the Book of Common Prayer, facing Presbyterian demands for modified church system that would accommodate tender consciences and include Presbyterian ministers within the national church. The Worcester House Declaration, issued by Charles II in October 1660, promised a moderate religious settlement that would modify the Book of Common Prayer, allow Presbyterian ordination to be supplemented by episcopal confirmation, and permit ministers some latitude in ceremony, apparently offering the comprehensive national church that would include both Anglican and Presbyterian elements that many had hoped would emerge from Restoration. The Savoy Conference, convened in 1661 to reconcile Anglican and Presbyterian positions regarding church, government and liturgy, demonstrated the impossibility of achieving genuine compromise, as bishops proved unwilling to make substantial modifications to traditional forms, while Presbyterian divines insisted on changes that would accommodate their theological convictions and liturgical practices, leading to breakdown of negotiations and subsequent Anglican dominance of the religious settlement. The Cavalier Parliament, elected in 1661, following dissolution of the Convention, proved overwhelmingly Anglican and Royalist in sentiment, including many members whose families had suffered for supporting Charles I during the wars, and who desired revenge against those who had opposed monarchy, creating an assembly more committed to restoring traditional church and state than Charles himself might have preferred. The Clarendon Code, enacted between 1661 and 1665 through a series of acts, including the Corporation Act, Act of Uniformity, Conventicle Act, and 5 Mile Act, systematically excluded from public office, university positions, and ordained ministry those who refused to conform to the restored Church of England, re-establishing Anglican monopoly on civil and ecclesiastical positions, while driving Presbyterian and independent ministers from their parishes and creating the permanent division between the established Church and Protestant dissent. The Act of Uniformity, passed in 1662, required all clergy to use the revised Book of Common Prayer, accept episcopal ordination, renounce the Solemn League and Covenant, and declare unlawful taking arms against the king under any circumstances, leading to the ejection of approximately 2,000 Presbyterian and independent ministers who could not accept these requirements, destroying hopes for a comprehensive national church, and establishing the denominational divisions that would characterize English Protestantism. The land settlement following the Restoration addressed the complex questions of property rights created by confiscations, forced sales, and purchases during the interregnum, with the Convention Parliament confirming sales that had been freely made, while generally restoring lands that had been confiscated from the Crown, the Church, and Royalists without compensation to those who had purchased them, creating grievances among both former parliamentarians who lost investments and Royalists who had been forced to sell estates to pay composition fines. The financial settlement provided Charles II with revenue through traditional sources, including customs duties granted for life and parliamentary taxation for specific purposes, but the total income available to the Crown proved inadequate for government expenses, particularly given the costs of maintaining naval forces and the King's tendency toward expensive foreign policies, creating continuing financial tensions between Crown and Parliament that recalled pre-Civil War conflicts. Charles II's personal rule during the 1660s combined outward conformity to constitutional constraints with preservation of substantial royal prerogative in foreign policy, military command, and ecclesiastical appointments, demonstrating that Restoration had not definitively resolved the constitutional questions that had divided King and Parliament before the Civil Wars, though both sides initially avoided pressing conflicts to the point of breakdown. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, beginning in 1665, resulted from commercial competition and maritime disputes that had persisted since the First War despite the peace treaty, producing major naval battles including the 4 Days Battle and the Street, James's Day Fight, that demonstrated the increasing scale and sophistication of naval warfare, while straining English finances and exposing the inadequacy of parliamentary supply for sustained military operations. The Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666 created national crises that that required governmental response, while also straining resources and disrupting commerce. Though the rebuilding of London, according to improved designs and with fire-resistant materials, demonstrated the capacity for recovery and improvement following catastrophe. The humiliating conclusion of the Second Anglo-Dutch War through the Treaty of Breda in 1667, after Dutch ships had raided the Medway, burned English ships, and captured the flagship, Royal Charles exposed English naval unpreparedness and governmental incompetence, while intensifying parliamentary criticism of Charles's ministers and foreign policy, leading to the Earl of Clarendon's dismissal and exile as scapegoat for failures that resulted from inadequate financing and strategic miscalculations. The Triple Alliance, with the Dutch Republic and Sweden, formed in 1668 to restrain French expansionism, represented Charles's public foreign policy that aligned England with Protestant powers against Catholic France, satisfying parliamentary and popular anti-Catholic sentiment while concealing the king's secret negotiations with Louis XIV that would produce very different alignment. The Treaty of Dover, secretly negotiated with France in 1670, committed Charles to support French military operations against the Dutch Republic in exchange for French subsidies that would reduce his dependence on parliamentary supply, while also including Charles's secret promise to declare his conversion to Catholicism when circumstances permitted, representing a foreign policy and religious commitment fundamentally opposed to the Protestant and anti-French sentiments that dominated Parliament and English public opinion. The Third Anglo-Dutch War, launched in 1672 as part of Charles's alliance with France against the Dutch Republic, proved unpopular in England, where commercial rivalry with the Dutch had diminished, while fear of French Catholic power had increased, leading Parliament to refuse adequate supply and to demand withdrawal from the war as price for granting taxation. The Declaration of Indulgence issued by Charles in 1672, using royal prerogative to suspend penal laws against Protestant dissenters and Catholics, represented the king's attempt to provide religious toleration, while also benefiting English Catholics, including members of the royal family. Though Parliament forced its withdrawal in 1673 by refusing supply until the declaration was revoked, reasserting parliamentary authority over religious policy against royal prerogative claims. The Test Act, passed by Parliament in 1673, required all holders of civil and military office to take communion in the Church of England and to repudiate Catholic doctrine regarding transubstantiation, effectively excluding Catholics from public service, while revealing that Charles's brother, James, Duke of York, was Catholic when he resigned his position as Lord High Admiral, rather than comply with the Act's requirements. The revelation of James's Catholicism, combined with Charles's lack of legitimate children, created the succession crisis that would dominate English politics for the remainder of the reign, as Protestant politicians confronted the prospect that a Catholic king would succeed to the throne, bringing dangers of arbitrary government and persecution. That historical memory associated with Mary's reign and contemporary observation associated with Louis XIV's France, the emergence of court and country political groupings during the 1670s reflected divisions over religious policy, foreign affairs, and constitutional questions, with the court factions supporting royal prerogative and accommodation with France, while the country opposition emphasized parliamentary authority, Protestant foreign policy, and resistance to Catholic influence, creating the foundations for the later Whig and Tory parties. The Popish plot hysteria, beginning in 1678, when Titus Oates presented fabricated evidence of Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Charles and establish Catholic tyranny, created widespread panic that enabled the country opposition to demand exclusion of James from the succession, while also leading to persecution of Catholics and execution of innocent men convicted on perjured testimony, demonstrating how fear of Catholicism could overwhelm judicial procedure and rational assessment of evidence. The exclusion crisis from 1679 to 1681 witnessed the country opposition's sustained campaign to pass legislation, excluding James from the succession and establishing an alternative Protestant succession, probably through Charles's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth. while Charles employed his prerogative to dissolve parliaments that attempted to pass exclusion bills, and eventually to govern without parliament, when it became clear that any parliament elected under prevailing circumstances would pursue exclusion. The three exclusion parliaments elected in 1679, 1680, and 1681 demonstrated strong support for exclusion among the gentry and urban populations who dominated parliamentary elections, reflecting widespread fear of Catholic succession and determination to preserve Protestant religion and English liberties against perceived threats from arbitrary monarchy, allied with international Catholicism. Charles II's success in defeating the exclusion movement, despite its apparent parliamentary strength, resulted from his ability to survive financially through French subsidies and improved revenue collection without parliamentary supply. The reaction against Whig extremism and their mobilization of urban crowds that appeared to threaten social order, and the support of Anglican Tories, who feared that exclusion would establish dangerous precedent for parliamentary interference with hereditary succession. The Oxford Parliament of 1681 concluded the exclusion crisis when Charles summoned Parliament to Oxford, away from London's intimidating crowds, and dissolved it after 1 week, when it became clear that the Commons would pursue exclusion, demonstrating the King's determination to preserve his brother's succession, while also marking the end of Charles's reliance on Parliament, as he would govern without parliamentary sessions for the remaining 4 years of reign. The Tory reaction following the defeat of exclusion witnessed systematic purging of Whig officials from local government, judicial persecution of Whig leaders through prosecutions for sedition and treason, and remodelling of urban corporations. To ensure Tory and Royalist control, reversing the political gains that the country opposition had achieved during the exclusion crisis, while establishing royal authority more firmly than at any point since the Restoration. The Rye House plot, discovered in 1683, an alleged conspiracy to assassinate Charles and James, provided justification for intensified persecution of Whig leaders, with some executed for treason, while others, including the Earl of Shaftesbury, fled to exile in the Netherlands, effectively destroying organised Whig opposition and leaving the succession secure when Charles died in February 1685. James II's accession in February 1685 proceeded smoothly, despite decades of opposition to Catholic succession, as the Tory reaction had eliminated effective resistance, while widespread commitment to hereditary succession and legitimacy overcame religious concerns, leading to a parliament elected in May 1685 that proved overwhelmingly loyal and granted generous revenue that made James financially independent of future parliamentary supply. The Monmouth Rebellion launched in June 1685 when Charles II's illegitimate son landed in southwest England and proclaimed himself king, failed to attract the widespread support that Monmouth and his advisers had expected, as most gentry refused to support a rebellion against legitimate succession, while only Protestant dissenters and agricultural workers joined Monmouth's forces that were quickly defeated at Sedgemoor in July. The bloody assizes conducted by Judge Jeffreys following Monmouth's defeat witnessed brutal punishment of rebels, including hundreds of executions and transportation of thousands to Caribbean plantations as slaves, demonstrating James's determination to crush resistance, while also revealing the vindictive cruelty that would characterize his approach to opposition throughout his brief reign. James's use of the Monmouth Rebellion to justify maintaining a standing army of approximately 20,000 men, officered partly by Catholics, whom he commissioned, despite Test Act prohibitions, created immediate parliamentary opposition when Parliament reassembled in November 1685, leading to confrontation when the Commons questioned the legality of Catholic officers and refused to repeal the Test Act, resulting in prorogation and ultimately dissolution, as James concluded that Parliament would obstruct his religious policies. The Declaration of Indulgence, issued in 1687, using royal prerogative to suspend penal laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters, represented James's attempt to achieve through prerogative what Parliament would not grant, through legislation. Though his primary concern was advancing Catholicism rather than genuine religious toleration, creating alliance with Protestant dissenters who welcomed relief from persecution, while alarming Anglicans who viewed the declaration as illegal usurpation of parliamentary authority and dangerous precedent for arbitrary government. The systematic Catholicization of government, military, and educational institutions proceeded through James's use of prerogative to appoint Catholics to positions in the army, navy, local government, Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and the judiciary despite statutory exclusions, demonstrating his determination to establish Catholic influence throughout English institutions, while provoking growing resistance from Anglicans who had initially supported his succession. The prosecution of the 7 bishops in 1688 for seditious libel after they petitioned against James's order that clergy read the Declaration of Indulgence from their pulpits resulted in their acquittal by a jury whose verdict provoked public celebrations, demonstrating that James had alienated even the Anglican establishment that had been his most reliable support, and that his policies had created broad coalition of opposition. The birth of James Francis, Edward Stuart, in June 1688, transformed the political situation by creating Catholic heir, whose succession would establish Catholic dynasty, rather than the temporary Catholic reign that opponents had been. Willing to tolerate expecting that James's Protestant daughters Mary and Anne would eventually succeed, leading to the invitation to William of Orange to intervene militarily to protect Protestant religion and English liberties. The Glorious Revolution accomplished through William of Orange's invasion in November 1688, with approximately 15,000 troops landing at Torbay, proceeded without significant military resistance, as James's army disintegrated through defections, including that of his leading general John Churchill, while James's flight to France in December effectively constituted abdication and allowed the Convention Parliament to declare the throne vacant and to offer it to William and Mary jointly. The Bill of Rights enacted in 1689, following William and Mary's acceptance of the crown, established constitutional principles, limiting royal prerogative, including prohibitions on suspending laws, maintaining standing armies in peacetime, and levying taxation without parliamentary consent, while also guaranteeing parliamentary free speech, frequent parliaments, and Protestant succession, creating the constitutional foundations for the parliamentary monarchy that would develop during the 18th century. The revolutionary settlement of 1689 resolved the constitutional and religious conflicts that had produced civil war, regicide, and political instability, by establishing parliamentary supremacy over crucial areas of governance, including taxation, military maintenance, and the frequency of parliamentary sessions, while the Protestant succession, secured through the Bill of Rights, eliminated the religious tensions that had dominated politics since the Reformation, by ensuring that England would remain a Protestant kingdom under parliamentary rather than absolute monarchical government. The Toleration Act of 1689 granted Protestant dissenters freedom of worship, though not full civil equality, ending the Anglican monopoly on legal religious practice that had been re-established at the Restoration, while maintaining sufficient disabilities on dissenters to preserve Anglican establishment as the privileged national church, creating a religious settlement that acknowledged Protestant diversity, while maintaining hierarchical distinctions. The financial revolution that followed the Glorious Revolution transformed English state capacity through creation of the Bank of England in 1694, development of the national debt as permanent institution funded through parliamentary taxation, and establishment of mechanisms for government borrowing that enabled England to sustain military expenditures far exceeding annual revenue, providing the fiscal foundations for England's emergence as a great power during the wars against Louis XIV. The War of the Spanish Succession, prosecuted by Marlborough's armies on the continent, demonstrated England's transformation from the Civil War era's military weakness into a major European military power capable of sustaining large armies abroad, while also maintaining substantial naval forces, reflecting both the administrative developments since 1660 and the constitutional settlement that enabled effective cooperation between Crown and Parliament in conducting foreign policy and warfare. The party political system that emerged during William's and Anne's reigns, built on the court-country divisions of Charles II's reign and the Whig-Tory conflicts during the Exclusion crisis, creating organised political groupings that competed for parliamentary majorities and ministerial positions, while representing different interests and principles. Though both parties accepted the revolutionary settlement and Protestant succession that had resolved the fundamental constitutional and religious conflicts. The long-term consequences of England's civil wars and the revolutionary settlement included establishment of parliamentary monarchy that would evolve into modern constitutional government, the development of political parties and cabinet government that enabled effective parliamentary leadership of the executive, the creation of fiscal and administrative systems that supported sustained military operations and imperial expansion, and the guarantee of Protestant religion and parliamentary liberties that would shape English political identity and distinguish English governance from continental absolute monarchies. The ideological legacy of the civil wars remained contested, as Whig historians celebrated Parliament's victory as progress toward liberty, while Tory perspectives emphasized the importance of legitimate authority and the dangers of popular resistance, creating competing historical narratives that would influence English political culture and constitutional theory for centuries. The social and economic changes accelerated by Civil War disruption included the decline of feudal tenures and obligations, the growth of a more commercial economy, less constrained by traditional regulations, the expansion of London as political and commercial centre, whose influence extended throughout the kingdom, and the emergence of a more mobile society in which status depended increasingly on wealth and education, rather than purely on inherited position. The religious pluralism that emerged from Civil War conflicts and the revolutionary settlement, though limited by modern standards and maintaining Anglican privileges, established practical toleration that allowed diverse Protestant denominations to coexist, while also creating space for the development of new religious movements, including Methodism, that would transform English religious life during the 18th century. The military legacy of the Civil Wars included the development of more professional military organization and tactics that influenced European warfare, the creation of the standing army and Royal Navy that would be instruments of English power projection globally, and the historical memory of military intervention in politics that would make both army and political leaders cautious about repeating the Civil War era's subordination of civilian authority to military force. The constitutional principles established through Civil War conflict and revolutionary settlement provided foundations for the development of representative government, rule of law, and protections for individual liberties that would influence constitutional development in England's American colonies and subsequently in the United States, demonstrating how the struggles of the 17th century shaped not only English but also broader Anglo-American political traditions. The resolution of England's 17th century crisis through the revolutionary settlement of 1689 and the subsequent development of parliamentary monarchy represented the definitive end of the constitutional conflicts that had produced civil war, establishing governmental structures and political principles that would provide stability and enable England's emergence as a major European and global power during the 18th century, while also creating constitutional precedents that would influence the development of representative government and limited monarchy throughout the Atlantic world and beyond. The memory of Civil War violence, regicide, and political chaos would serve for generations as cautionary tale about the dangers of political extremism and armed resistance to established authority, encouraging pragmatic compromise and incremental reform rather than revolutionary upheaval, though different political factions would interpret this history according to their own principles and interests. The historiographical debates that emerged during the Restoration and continued through subsequent centuries reflected competing attempts to assign responsibility for civil war and to draw appropriate lessons from the conflicts, with Royalist accounts emphasizing parliamentary ambition and Puritan fanaticism, while parliamentarian histories stressed Charles I's arbitrary government and Catholic conspiracies, creating narratives that served contemporary political purposes, while also preserving different perspectives on the war's causes and significance. The legal and institutional changes that survived from the interregnum, despite the Restoration's attempt to re-establish traditional forms, included simplified procedures in some areas of law, the permanent elimination of certain feudal obligations and courts, and administrative innovations that proved useful regardless of the governmental form that employed them, demonstrating that even failed revolutionary experiments could produce lasting practical improvements. The cultural impact of the civil wars manifested in literature, political theory, and religious thought that grappled with questions of allegiance, resistance, authority, and liberty raised by the conflicts, producing works ranging from Hobbes's Leviathan, analysing sovereignty and social order, to Milton's political tracts defending regicide and religious toleration, to Clarendon's history presenting royalist perspective on the wars, creating an intellectual legacy that would influence subsequent political philosophy and historical understanding. The demographic consequences of the wars included population losses through military casualties, disease, and reduced births that affected some regions more severely than others, while also producing migration patterns as some fled areas of intense fighting and as defeated royalists and later Whigs sought refuge abroad during periods when their factions faced persecution, contributing to colonial development in America and creating exile communities that maintained political networks and plotted returns. The economic disruption caused by civil war fighting, requisitions, taxation, and the interruption of normal commercial activities created hardship that affected different social groups unequally, with small farmers and craftsmen often suffering most severely, while some merchants and military contractors profited from war conditions, contributing to social tensions that would persist beyond the war's conclusion and influence subsequent political alignments. The destruction of property through siege operations, deliberate slighting of fortifications, and the general chaos of military campaigns left physical marks on the English landscape, including ruined castles and manor houses that had been fortified during the wars, damaged churches, and depopulated villages, though rebuilding proceeded relatively quickly in most areas. Once sustained peace returned. The development of propaganda and political communication during the civil wars, through proliferation of printed pamphlets, news books, and political tracts, created a more politically engaged and informed population that would prove difficult for subsequent governments to control through traditional mechanisms of censorship and deference, establishing precedents for public political debate that would continue to expand despite periodic attempts at repression. The role of London throughout the conflicts as Parliament's primary base, source of finance, and centre of radical political and religious activity demonstrated the capital's political significance, while also revealing tensions between London's citizens and parliamentary leadership. When popular mobilization threatened elite control, creating patterns of metropolitan political activism that would recur throughout subsequent centuries. The experience of military service during the civil wars exposed thousands of ordinary men to political and religious ideas that challenged traditional hierarchies, while also demonstrating through the new model army that common soldiers could achieve military effectiveness equal to forces led by aristocratic commanders, creating a legacy of popular political consciousness that authorities found threatening even after demobilization returned most soldiers to civilian life. The failed radical movements of the Civil War era, including the Levellers, Diggers, and Fifth Monarchists, left ideological legacies that would resurface in later periods when social and political tensions created receptive audiences for egalitarian ideas, demonstrating that the civil wars had unleashed aspirations and arguments that could not be permanently suppressed, despite the defeat of their initial proponents. The relationship between England, Scotland, and Ireland transformed through the Civil War period's military conquests and constitutional experiments, with Cromwellian conquest establishing English dominance over both kingdoms, while also creating resentments and patterns of resistance that would shape subsequent British history, demonstrating how the Civil War's resolution in England had profound consequences